Daenerys Targaryen stood upon the scorching red bricks of Astapor's Grand Plaza, gazing at a city that baked beneath the unrelenting sun. The wind off Slaver's Bay tasted of salt and blood, and it rattled the palms that rose in patches throughout the city. Her silver-white hair clung to the sweat on her brow, yet she did not step back into the shade offered by the surrounding buildings. She wanted them all to see her. The slavers, the unsullied, the curious throngs of onlookers peering from behind crumbling walls and half-curtained windows. She stood rigid, unwavering, robed in pale linen that billowed slightly in the thick, salt-laden breeze. And behind her, looming in the distance with shadows that stretched longer by the hour, stood the three living flames she had brought into the world: Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. Though her dragons had not yet reached the monstrous dimensions they would soon boast, they were already larger than any man had a right to behold. Their wings spanned wide enough to blot out the sun for a moment if they soared directly overhead, and their screeches rippled across the plaza like thunder in the mountains. The heat rising from their scaled bodies mingled with the desert air, creating a shimmering haze that lent them an otherworldly aura. Astapor's meager garrison of unsmiling soldiers stared in a mixture of awe and fear. Daenerys had heard tales of the old Valyrian dragons from her brother Viserys, who had spoken often and boastfully of Balerion the Black Dread. She had tried to picture a creature so fearsome that entire fields were said to have burned to ash beneath his wings. But now, she looked at her own children, as they were, and she believed wholeheartedly that a day would come when Balerion would seem only a forerunner to the might of her brood. She simply had not expected that day might dawn so soon. The transaction in Astapor was nearly complete. Krasny's Naklas, clad in his tokar, was ready to hand over the whip that symbolized ownership of the Unsullied. He clutched it with the oily confidence of a man who believed he had outsmarted a foolish young girl. He spoke rapidly in High Valyrian, each word laced with contempt, though he believed the silver-haired Targaryen in front of him did not understand his tongue. Daenerys kept her face as still as stone, letting him rattle on. She was thinking not only of the slaver's impending betrayal but also of the hidden truth throbbing in her heart. Her dragons would soon become more than the world had ever witnessed. She felt a swirl of both excitement and dread whenever her mind lingered on the possibility. The red comet that had streaked the sky months prior had been hailed as her harbinger, a sign of fire and blood. The priests of R'hllor she had encountered in passing insisted the Lord of Light had chosen her for a grand purpose. At first, she had dismissed such talk as yet another attempt at flattery or manipulation. But in the nights leading up to her arrival in Astapor, she had dreamed strange dreams of flame and darkness, of a massive shape that spanned horizon to horizon, a living fire that dwarfed even the greatest dragons of old. In those dreams, she heard a voice. Sometimes it was a roar, sometimes a whisper, but always it said, "Grow." Dany's eyes flickered to Drogon, always the largest, always the most willful. Even now, his obsidian scales shone with an intensity that made them appear aflame when the sun struck at a certain angle. He hissed, revealing teeth like daggers as he regarded Krasny's with a predator's stare. The slaver kept looking at Drogon sidelong, fear creeping into his voice despite his arrogance. Rhaegal and Viserion waited a short distance away, clawed feet scraping on the ground, stirring dust into the air as they flapped their wings in agitation. The Unsullied, stoic in their ranks, had no outward reaction, for they had been trained not to respond to such fearsome displays. Yet Daenerys sensed a tremor in the air, an excitement that went beyond their unblinking gazes. "Khaleesi," Ser Jorah Mormont said softly, stepping closer. He had followed her everywhere, from the Red Waste to Qarth, from Qarth to these slaver cities, always her devoted knight-errant. She cast him a brief glance, sensing the concern in his eyes. "Are you certain you want to go through with this charade?" She answered him in the common tongue so Krasny's would not glean her meaning. "I am. The city will never be free unless I take their whip from them." She could have added that she had no intention of leaving the city in the hands of those who had so brazenly sold human lives. But Jorah knew that, for he knew her. He nodded, albeit reluctantly, and retreated a step to stand guard by her side. Krasny's Emonaklas shifted his weight on plump feet and approached, the whip in his hand trembling slightly as if he, too, felt the aura surrounding Daenerys's dragons. He wore a thin sheen of sweat across his brow that the city's heat alone did not explain. His eyes flickered back and forth between Daenerys and the dragons, as if seeking assurance that his cunning plan would proceed smoothly. "Here," the slaver said in clipped Balerion, gesturing to the whip, "you understand that once you accept this, the Unsullied shall be yours to command, yes?" He spoke through his translator in the common tongue. Daenerys kept her silence a moment longer, letting the hush of the plaza deepen. She stood, seemingly uncertain in that instant, her hand not yet reaching for the whip. Krasny smirked, thinking her a frightened child. He had no idea that this same child had stepped into a funeral pyre not so long ago and walked out reborn. After an excruciating pause, Daenerys's hand closed around the whip's leather handle. She felt a surge of triumph pass through her, yet she kept her face controlled. She turned and raised the whip high, letting the Astapori see it. Gasps and mutterings ran through the crowd. Across the plaza, the three dragons hissed, as if in recognition of something deeper, older. Rhaegal's green and bronze wings flapped, scattering dust and sand. Viserion's pale horns glinted like ivory, and Drogon, massive and black as midnight, prowled forward. The Unsullied stood unreactive, eyes forward. Daenerys spoke, but not meekly. Her voice, refined by her Targaryen heritage, carried that ring of authority she had once only dreamed of possessing. Her Valyrian was flawless. "Unsullied, you are mine now. Will you kill every master who holds a whip against you? Will you kill the slavers, break their power, and free the city?" A ripple passed through their ranks. They raised their spears in unison, awaiting her command. The hush was a living thing, until Daenerys pointed that whip toward the high terrace where the good masters stood. In the ancient tongue, she gave the one word that would shape the future, Dracarys. Astonishment and sudden terror dawned on Krasny's face as he realized she had understood everything he'd said. But that flash of revelation came too late. Drogon, as if infused with wild joy, opened his colossal maw and let forth a blast of scorching flame. In that moment, the city erupted. Spear met flesh. The good masters panicked. Astapor's minuscule garrison could not withstand the surge of freed slaves. Daenerys's plan, meticulously orchestrated, played out in blazing splendor. The dragons soared overhead, unleashing torrents of fire upon the crumbling battlements, and the Unsullied marched forward to claim the city for their new queen. Smoke billowed in thick, acrid clouds, and the stench of burning flesh and charred brick filled the air. Daenerys did not flinch. She watched with cold determination, for she believed wholly that no innocent blood would be spilled. The Unsullied were too disciplined for that. The only ones who died by spear or flame were those who profited from bondage, those who had flogged and maimed and sold her people as cattle. She had no mercy for the slavers, no pity for their losses. She had counted on the dragons being fearsome, but even she was taken aback by the ferocity of Drogon's unleashed might. He seemed to grow stronger as his flames danced across the city's walls, as if the very heat and chaos fed his strength. Rhaegal and Viserion joined, swirling in the sky like two lesser suns. Yet even they were overshadowed by their brother's size and power. By nightfall, the city had surrendered utterly to Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. She stood amid the plaza, breathing in smoke and the tang of victory. The Astapori who survived, free men and women now, fell to their knees in gratitude and awe. The Unsullied lined up before her, thousand upon thousand, awaiting her next command. She lifted the whip one last time and tossed it aside. Then she looked to the Unsullied and pronounced them free. "You owe me no duty now," she said, her voice carrying across the plaza. "Yet I ask you to fight for me as free men if you would." They stamped their spears in unison, a resounding declaration that reverberated through the heart of the city. Astapor belonged to Daenerys Targaryen, the breaker of chains. In the days that followed, Daenerys worked to restore order in the battered city. Scores of freedmen wandered the streets, uncertain how to live without chains around their necks. She had Missandei, once a slave herself, speak words of comfort and reason to them. She posted the Unsullied around the city's perimeter to ensure no slaver fled without facing judgment. She listened to grievances, to entreaties from those who had labored in the depths of Astapor's fighting pits. All the while, her dragons prowled the rooftops, roost on broken parapets, and soared across Slaver's Bay in brief hunting forays. Dany caught glimpses of them gliding above the city, their silhouettes enormous against the setting sun. It was said the people of Astapor began to call her Mysa, mother, for she had given them new life. It was a name she cherished. Yet the nights remained restless. Daenerys dreamed again and again of flames that stretched across the horizon, of a dragon so vast it blotted out not merely the sun but entire stars. In her dream, she stood upon a high bluff, arms raised as if in supplication, and the beast descended upon her. Its voice was a thunderous roar, but within that roar was a whisper that made her heart tremble. Grow. She awoke each time in a tangle of sweat-drenched sheets, her heart pounding. She would slip from her bed and walk to the balcony where she could see her dragons perched on distant towers or curled up in the palace's courtyard, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. She felt a stirring deep in her chest, an instinct that warned her change was coming, a change she had not accounted for. One starlit evening, as she was walking alone beneath the battered colonnades of Astapor's central courtyard, she found herself confronted by a most unusual visitor. Cloaked in tattered red robes, leaning heavily upon a gnarled staff, was a priestess of R'hllor. Her hair was as red as blood, her face lined with age, her eyes gleaming with something akin to devotion. Daenerys Stormborn, she called, her voice echoing in the stillness. Azor Ahai Reborn, mother of dragons. Dany stiffened. She had heard many rumors about Azor Ahai, that mythical champion of the Lord of Light. The Red Priests in Qarth had uttered that name in reference to her, but she had refused to delve too deeply into their doctrines. She believed in her own strength, in the might of her dragons, but it was never her wish to be the champion of any deity. "Why do you call me that?" Daenerys said guardedly. The moonlight etched silver along her hair. "I am no champion of your god." "Oh, but you are chosen," the priestess intoned. "We saw the red comet. We have gazed into the fires and beheld your visage. Your dragons are the harbinger of R'hllor's victory over the darkness. And you, my queen, shall bring the dawn." Daenerys frowned, her breath quickening. She had no desire to become a puppet of any faith. "I know only that I was destined to break chains, to free slaves. My dragons are mine alone." The priestess's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Would you deny your children the power that is their birthright?" "Power," Daenerys repeated, suspicion tight in her throat. "Power beyond mortal reckoning," the priestess said. "The Lord of Light reveals that these dragons shall surpass all that came before. Balerion the Black Dread, Merax's Vagor, all pale shadows of what your children shall become." Daenerys stared, uncertain how to respond. She remembered her dreams, the gargantuan silhouette that devoured the skies. "What would you have me do?" "I have come only to deliver a message," the priestess said gently. "In the house of the Undying you saw visions. You know what must be done. The dragons grow with fire, with blood, with faith." The mention of the house of the Undying sent a jolt of memory through her. She had seen so many illusions there, but among them a vision of a great red door, of a man with silver hair naming her mother of dragons, of 1,000 perished kings kneeling before her. It all felt so muddled. "Faith alone will not feed them," Daenerys said. "All that you are, all that you carry in your blood, in your soul. These are the gifts that shall usher in an age of fire," the priestess murmured. "When you dream, listen to the voice in the flame. Remember that all things which are given may be taken away, unless they are won by birthright and destiny." Without another word, the priestess bowed deeply, her face glowing in the pale moonlight, then withdrew into the shadows. Daenerys stood for a moment, unsettled, her heart thrumming in her chest. She did not call for her guards, nor did she pursue the priestess. Some part of her believed that if she tried, she would find no one there. She could not deny the sense of otherworldly calm that settled over her after the encounter, or the subtle stirring of something deeper within her. In the week that followed, Astapor continued to adjust to its new status as a free city under Daenerys' rule. Many advised her to move on, to conquer Yunkai next, then Meereen. But Daenerys lingered. She oversaw the distribution of food, the establishment of rudimentary councils to govern in her absence, and the organization of the Unsullied into divisions that could march at her command. She listened to Missandei's counsel and to Ser Jorah's, and each night she waited for the next dream, the next sign. One moonless night, she awakened to the sound of roars echoing through the palace corridors. She dashed to her balcony, heart hammering, expecting an attack or riot. Instead, she found her dragons below in the courtyard, their silhouettes black against the starlit sky. Rhaegal and Viserion circled Drogon, who reared on his hind legs. Daenerys peered over the balcony rail, eyes widening. Drogon's wings stretched wider than before, impossibly wide. She blinked, wondering if the darkness was playing tricks on her. It looked as though his wingspan had doubled overnight. The membranes shimmered with an uncanny luminescence, as if absorbing the faint moonlight. His talons clawed at the stone yard, gouging deep furrows. He roared again, a deafening challenge, as if calling to something beyond the city walls. She glanced at Rhaegal and Viserion. They, too, had changed in subtle ways. Their necks had grown longer, their horns sharper. Their eyes glowed with a ferocious intensity. Alarm and wonder warred within Daenerys. She quickly dressed and rushed down to the courtyard, accompanied by Ser Barristan Selmy and Ser Jorah Mormont, who appeared moments later with blades drawn, expecting trouble. The air in the courtyard felt charged, as if laced with lightning. Drogon lashed his tail, smashing a stone bench into fragments. He turned at the sound of Daenerys' footsteps, rumbling low in his throat. Smoke curled from his nostrils, and a flicker of flame danced between his jaws. Rhaegal and Viserion flanked him, both hissing, yet their aggression ebbed the moment Daenerys drew near. She approached slowly, hands raised, ignoring Ser Jorah's cautionary whisper. Drogon bared his teeth but did not strike. She felt an unspoken connection, a bond hammered into being the night she had walked through fire and birthed them into the world. Over and over, she whispered, "Dracarys," as if in benediction, but no further flames came. Instead, Drogon lowered his head. He was enormous, far larger than he had been only days prior. Daenerys placed a trembling hand on his scaled snout, and a wave of heat pulsed through her palm. "They've grown," Barristan said in a hushed voice, as if stating the obvious. "No," Jorah murmured. "This is more than just growing." Daenerys did not need him to elaborate. The transformation was plain. She sensed that Drogon could tear through stone walls if he wished. She could feel the sheer power humming beneath his obsidian scales. Was this the blessing of R'hllor, or was it the blood of old Valyria asserting itself through her children? She remembered the priestess's words. The dragons grow with fire, with blood, with faith. In the days that followed, a sense of awe gripped the city. Drogon soared over Astapor's rooftops like a living storm cloud, casting an immense shadow that turned day into twilight for all beneath him. Some said he had grown larger than Caraxes or any dragon from the near history of Westeros. Others insisted this new metamorphosis was not natural at all, that it was a sign from the Lord of Light, or a dark omen portending destruction. Daenerys herself stood at the heart of the speculation, both enthralled and fearful. Rhaegal and Viserion, though overshadowed by Drogon's size and presence, were hardly diminished. They, too, continued to grow at a startling pace. Their roars rattled window panes, and their fiery breath could melt iron in seconds. Whenever she walked among them, Daenerys felt the bond she had forged in the flames intensify. She recalled the Targaryen motto, "Fire and Blood." It had been a warning as much as a promise. Perhaps all the world needed reminding. One evening, after the city had quieted into uneasy sleep, Daenerys stood on the highest terrace of the Great Pyramid of Astapor, watching the moonlight play upon Drogon's black scales as he perched upon a parapet. The other two dragons roost below, making the buildings look like children's toys by comparison. Missandei joined her, silent at first, wearing a simple linen shift. "They grow beyond measure, your grace," Missandei said at length. She spoke softly, half in wonder, half in trepidation. Daenerys nodded, her heart heavy with the responsibility. "Yes, the people fear this power. Some kneel in worship. Others whisper that the days of the Balerion freehold have returned, and that we will soon see armies of dragons devour entire nations." "Fear can be a weapon," Daenerys said. She rested her palms on the balustrade, the stone warm beneath her fingers. "But it can also turn good people away. I freed Astapor so that these men and women might choose a life for themselves, not cower in fear of new masters." Missandei's voice was gentle. "But you are no master, my queen. You gave them freedom. You simply wield the power that is yours by blood." "Power is never simple," Daenerys murmured. She looked at Drogon again. In the moonlight, it seemed he had grown further still, his wings stretching like vast sails. She could almost believe he would eclipse the moon if he took flight. A flutter of anxiety stirred within her. He is becoming something the world has not seen in thousands of years. If that priestess spoke truly, he will grow larger than Balerion Ev. Daenerys remembered her brother's tales, how Balerion's flames had blackened entire fields and melted the iron of Harrenhal into slag. If Drogon surpassed that, if Rhaegal and Viserion did the same, she could conquer Essos in a fortnight, perhaps. She could cross the narrow sea and reclaim her father's throne in a storm of dragonfire. But was that the only path? The notion of unstoppable power both thrilled and frightened her. She closed her eyes, recalling the dream, that whispered roar, "Grow." A question lingered in her mind. To what end? The next morning, Daenerys called a council of her closest advisors, Ser Jorah, Ser Barristan, Grey Worm, Missandei, and a handful of others. They gathered in the Great Pyramid's audience chamber, where pillars rose like petrified giants. Sunlight streamed through slitted windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. She took her seat upon a newly fashioned throne of polished wood and brass, eschewing the gaudy opulence of the old masters. "I must speak openly," she began. "You have all seen what my dragons have become. This is no ordinary growth. Each day they seem to surge in size, in power. I need your counsel as to what this means for us, and for the cities we have yet to free." Ser Barristan, clad in white silk, his silver hair shining like a halo, bowed his head respectfully. "Your Grace, I have known dragons only in memory and rumor, but never have I heard tales of such rapid changes. It is said that once upon a time, in the earliest days of Valyria, dragons were shaped by blood sorcery. Could it be that the magic of old Valyria has awakened?" Ser Jorah stroked his beard, casting a wary glance. "We dwell in uncertain times. A red comet in the sky, the rebirth of dragons, omens everywhere. Magic flows again, or so it seems. If your children are indeed touched by a higher power, we can use that power to enforce your claim. Slavers' Bay shall be free, and the Iron Throne yours." Daenerys folded her hands in her lap. "And at what cost? There are children in these cities, people who look to me for deliverance, not devastation. I do not wish to become what my father was, a tyrant. If the dragons keep growing at this rate, I fear we may not be able to restrain them, especially Drogon." Grey Worm, representing the Unsullied, stood stoically. "We obey you, Commander. If the dragons are your weapons, we will use them as you command." "But he faltered a moment, for he was not used to speaking so freely. "I have seen the slaves rejoice in their freedom. If the dragons cause too much death, the people may think they have traded one horror for another." Missandei's gaze flicked toward Daenerys, sympathy etched in her features. "The freedmen of Astapor trust you, my queen, but I have heard frightened whispers. Some believe the dragons will soon devour the entire city or turn the sky to fire. They know not what to expect." Daenerys nodded, absorbing all this. The burden rested heavily upon her slender shoulders. "I will not abandon my dragons," she said with quiet resolve. "They are my children, my birthright, yet I must ensure their power does not run wild." A hush fell over the council. Finally, Barristan spoke in a measured tone. "Your Grace, perhaps we might look to the lore of old Valyria for guidance. There could be rituals or spells meant to guide or temper a dragon's growth." She thought of the priestess of R'hllor, whose words had stirred both hope and apprehension. Was it truly the Lord of Light who fueled this transformation, or was it the ancient Targaryen bloodline forging a new path? Her mind spun with possibilities. "Gather what knowledge you can," she told them, "but do it swiftly, for I will not tarry in Astapor much longer. Yunkai awaits, then Meereen. I made a promise to myself that I would free every slave city in Slaver's Bay." Thus, her advisors scattered to fulfill her wishes, and Daenerys returned to her role as queen of the liberated city. Yet every passing day, the dragons tested the boundaries of her control. One afternoon, Drogon took flight, soared across the bay, and returned bearing the carcass of a massive sea creature, half of it scorched black. He dropped it in the city's outskirts, a prize for his mother. The stench alone was enough to drive the watchers away. Daenerys hurried to the site, where dozens of freedmen gaped in horror or reverence. She tried to calm Drogon, to stroke his scaled flank as he devoured his kill. She could feel the heat radiating from him in waves. His eyes blazed with an intelligence that nearly made her step back. And so it continued. Each day, Rhaegal and Viserion found ways to test themselves, leveling small outbuildings when they took off in flight, scorching the edges of Astapor's walls in playful spats with each other. Twice, Daenerys had to order the Unsullied to help contain small fires that erupted when the dragons' roaring battles singed the city. Though the freedmen still loved their Mysa, the hush that fell whenever a dragon shadow passed overhead was laced with fear. Eventually, she gave the order to break camp. Astapor was free, and her newly formed council would remain behind to keep it that way. She had the Unsullied gather enough provisions for a march across the desert roads that led to Yunkai. Those who wished to fight for her followed, hundreds of freed slaves, men and women both, armed with whatever they could scrounge. A few warrior eunuchs from Astapor joined the Unsullied ranks, and new volunteers who had been too old or unfit for the master's standards but who wished to fight for their breaker of chains. She marched at the head, pale banners with the three-headed dragon sigil fluttering in the searing wind. Dust rose beneath the footfalls of thousands. Drogon and his brothers wheeled overhead, black silhouettes against a sky of blazing blue. The desert stretched out before them, cruel and unrelenting, but Daenerys led them on. The crossing took weeks. The sun was merciless, pounding down upon them. Daenerys rode her white mare at times but often walked among her followers, giving them water, encouraging them to keep going. Ser Jorah would caution her to preserve herself, but she insisted. She remembered a time when she had been lost in the Red Waste, with only her Khalasar to sustain her. That memory fueled her compassion. All the while, the dragons continued to grow. It was visible day by day, as if their bones stretched to accommodate some unstoppable force. By the time they reached the outskirts of Yunkai, Drogon's wingspan rivaled the length of a galleon. His roaring hunts lit the horizon at night, a dark shape searing the clouds themselves. Rhaegal and Viserion, though still smaller, were more massive than any warhorse, their tails like battering rams. Soldiers cowered at the mere thought of facing such beasts. Yunkai was a walled city, renowned for its bedslaves more than its fighters. Yet it boasted Sellsword companies and a formidable garrison that prided itself on never having fallen to outside forces. As Daenerys' army approached, she sent out envoys, offering the Yunkish lords a simple choice: free every slave or face the wrath of her dragons. She waited 3 days for a reply. It arrived in the form of 2 Yunkish men, lavishly dressed, carried in a palanquin by trembling slaves. They offered gold, jewels, and slaves of exquisite beauty. If Daenerys would turn away, she refused. She demanded freedom for all, pointing to Drogon, perched upon a sandy ridge, glaring at the delegation with molten eyes. They wavered, retreated, and promised to deliver her terms to the wise masters of Yunkai. That night, Daenerys stood on a dune overlooking the city. She could see the tall walls illuminated by torches, the flicker of movement as Yunkai's defenders prepared for siege. Ser Jorah and Ser Barristan stood behind her. Grey Worm was off organizing the Unsullied. Missandei waited near a small brazier. "They will not yield," Ser Jorah remarked grimly. "They rely on their walls, on the strength of their mercenary captains. Perhaps they think you are bluffing." Daenerys let out a quiet laugh that held no mirth. "I do not bluff. If they force my hand, I will break their walls and burn their defenses. But I pray they see sense." Barristan bowed his head. "Even if they do not yield, your grace, we have the advantage. I have seen many sieges, but never have I seen dragons used to such effect." He glanced at Drogon, who sat vigilant, like an ebon fortress of bone and scale. "The walls of Yunkai will not hold." She gazed at her black dragon, recalling the stories of Balerion scorching Harrenhal. Balerion was said to have melted towers in a single breath. What would Drogon do now that he seemed well on his way to surpassing the Black Dread? She felt a strange shiver, equal parts exultation and dread. "R'Lalares flame," she muttered under her breath, recalling the priestess's cryptic words. When dawn broke, the Yunkish refused to relent. Their gates remained sealed, their defenders arrayed along the walls with scorpions and siege engines. Daenerys gave the order. The city would be taken by day's end. The horns of the Unsullied sounded, a low rumble that unsettled the desert air. Thousands of freedmen readied themselves, some trembling, others eager to reclaim the families stolen by Yunkai's slave markets. Daenerys mounted her mare, but she kept Drogon in her line of sight. Rhaegal and Viserion flanked him in the sky. She raised her arm and the armies advanced. The Yunkish catapults lobbed stones over the walls, and the Sellswords loosed arrows from high battlements. Many found their marks among the freedmen in the front ranks, but the Unsullied advanced without breaking formation. When they neared the walls, ladders were raised, grappling hooks thrown. Arrows fell like stinging rain. Daenerys watched from a vantage on a dune. The city spread out before her like a fortress of defiance. It was time. She lifted a hand, and Drogon took flight with a roar that shook the heavens. She heard the watchers on the city walls cry out in terror. At first, some loosed arrows at him, but their barbs glanced off his scales or lodged harmlessly in the membrane of his wings. Then Rhaegal and Viserion joined, swooping low, unleashing gouts of flame upon the battlements. The walls of Yunkai were stout, built of brick and mortar, but they were never meant to endure direct dragon assault. Barristan's voice carried over the din, "The scorpions, your grace. They might still harm the dragons if well aimed." Indeed, the Yunkish defenders scrambled to pivot large siege crossbows. One bolt streaked through the air, grazing Rhaegal's wing. He shrieked in anger, unleashing a furious blast of fire that incinerated the scorpion and its crew in a heartbeat. Another bolt soared high and missed Drogon entirely. Daenerys spurred her horse closer, feeling the thunder of battle pulse in her blood. She directed the Unsullied captains to focus their assault at a weakened section of the walls, where flames from the dragons had begun to eat through the mortar. With iron discipline, they advanced, shields locked, spears at the ready, even as boiling oil rained down from above. But then Drogon descended like a black comet, smashing onto the ramparts. His talons rent the stone, and his jaws unleashed a torrent of fire. Yunkish men leaped from the walls in desperate attempts to escape the blaze. As stone crumbled beneath the dragon's fury, a section of the wall collapsed in a plume of dust and screams. Daenerys watched in both horror and grim satisfaction as the path to the city was laid open. Through the gap, her forces poured in, overwhelming the scattered defenses with little mercy. The Sellsword captains, realizing the hopelessness of their stand, began to flee or surrender. The smoke and chaos might have swallowed lesser armies, but Daenerys's disciplined Unsullied parted the swirling dust like a spear thrust. Drums sounded victory as men and women took up the cry of "Mysa! Mysa!" The city that had refused her terms now lay at her feet. She rode through the battered gates, seeing the terror on the faces of Yunkish citizens who had never expected such a swift downfall. Many were slaves, their eyes filling with tears of desperate hope when they saw her banners. Others were owners, or at least once had been, cowering and covering their heads. The stench of blood, fire, and rubble churned her stomach, but she pressed on. This was war, she reminded herself. War to end slavery. Regal and Vizirian soared overhead, their triumphant cries echoing through the battered streets. Yet it was Drogon who claimed the city's skyline. Landing atop the golden pyramid at Yunkai's heart, he roared, his voice rolling across the desert beyond. Daenerys glimpsed the black silhouette of him perched there, and her breath caught. He seemed so large that the pyramid might crack beneath his weight. Before sunset, the city formally surrendered. Daenerys repeated her actions in Astapor. She freed every slave, broke every chain, and demanded that the masters relinquish power. Some complied, others tried to hide or slip away. The Unsullied dealt with them swiftly. She established a temporary council, manned by freedmen who had quickly shown their loyalty and competence. The second city had fallen, and Daenerys Stormborn was quickly becoming more than a rumor. Word spread like wildfire across Essos. The mother of dragons was real, and her dragons were bigger than any living memory. Some said bigger than any who had ever lived. For with each passing day, the trio showed no sign of halting their growth. At times, Daenerys would stare at them, especially Drogon, and wonder if there was any limit. His wings seemed to blot out half the sky. When he roared, it felt like an earthquake. Reports came from the scouts that Yunkai's countryside was scorched in wide swathes where Drogon hunted. He left footprints in the sands that were larger than the largest warhorse. Regal and Vizirian, too, were growing faster than logic allowed. Every night, Daenerys sat alone in the newly claimed quarters of the city's Great Pyramid, listening to the distant roars of her children. No more fleeting dreams now. Her slumber was besieged by visions of flame and shadow. She saw the shape of an impossible dragon, wings beating like thunder, scorching entire realms. She would wake, trembling, suspecting that shape was Drogon's future. Or was it some echo of the Lord of Light's prophecy? She recalled the priestess's parting words. The dragons grow with fire, with blood, with faith. She had spilled blood, and her dragons feasted on the spoils of war. Her faith, if it could be called that, was uncertain, but something older and deeper than she understood was fueling them. She resolved to press on, for the liberation of Meereen was next, and after that, her destiny might well take her across the sea to Westeros. When her host finally marched on Meereen, the greatest city of Slaver's Bay, many watchers upon its towering walls gaped at the approach of Daenerys Targaryen. For in the skies above, 3 impossibly colossal dragons wheeled and roared. The watchers had heard rumors but never believed them. Their day of reckoning had come. Meereen was more fortified than Yunkai or Astapor, with walls of massive proportions. It was said that even dragons might think twice before assailing them. But that was before Drogon's growth had reached a point that defied imagination. His wings now spanned so wide that men said he could shade entire armies beneath them. His roar could be heard leagues away, and the heat of his flame was rumored to melt stone on contact. Regal and Vizirian, though smaller, were monstrous in their own right, easily overshadowing the fabled dragons of recent Targaryen history. Daenerys set up camp in the fields outside Meereen. She scouted the city walls, searching for weaknesses, but the Meereenese were not blind. They had prepared for her arrival. She saw the glint of fresh scorpions, catapults loaded with barrels of pitch, and archers too numerous to count. They would not surrender easily. Word reached her that Meereen took pride in its fighting pits, which drew spectators from every corner of Essos. Slaves fought and died there for the amusement of the wealthy. This city was, in many ways, the greatest stronghold of the old slaver culture. She could not abide leaving it undefeated. Still, she hoped to spare the innocent from the horror of a direct assault by her dragons. To that end, she tried negotiations. She sent envoys to the great masters, offering to accept their peaceful surrender if they freed every slave and pledged loyalty to her new order. She asked only that the chains be broken, that the men, women, and children forcibly kept in bondage be allowed to walk free. Days passed in tense waiting. Meanwhile, the Meereenese showed no sign of capitulation. They instead taunted Daenerys, sending out small cavalry raids to test her lines, flinging insults from the walls, and even catapulting the heads of prisoners they believed loyal to her cause. It became clear that the rulers of Meereen had no intention of bending. Daenerys could have unleashed Drogon and his brothers upon the city immediately, as she had done in Yunkai. But she hesitated. Meereen's population dwarfed that of the other two cities, and the potential for massive civilian casualties weighed on her conscience. She did not want to be remembered as a queen of ash. Ser Jorah tried to reassure her, pointing out that the Meereenese had chosen war. Ser Barristan counseled caution, recalling the tragedies that befell the Targaryens when they relied too heavily upon dragons without concern for the aftermath. Even as she deliberated, word came that the Meereenese were flaying slaves alive, pinning their remains on the gates to display their defiance of the breaker of chains. With each atrocity, Daenerys felt her resolve harden. Her blood burned with Targaryen wrath, fanned by the sight of a city that gloried in barbarism. She stood atop a ridge one morning, gazing at Meereen. The rising sun gleamed on the city's high walls, and the desert wind rustled her silver hair. Beside her, Drogon stood like a living fortress, each breath sending a wave of heat across the sand. When she laid her hand on his side, she felt his vast heart beating, a thunder beneath impenetrable scales. "This has to end," she whispered. "Every moment we wait, more suffer behind those walls." Drogon stretched his neck forward, almost as if he understood. Rhaegal and Viserion circled overhead, the sun glinting off their colored scales. Daenerys descended the ridge to where her generals waited. Grey Worm, Missandei, Ser Jorah, and Barristan formed a small circle around a crude map drawn in the dust. She announced her decision. A final offer of surrender would be delivered to the city. If they refused, the dragons would breach the walls. Her advisors exchanged grim glances, but none objected. They had seen what resistance to Daenerys' quest for liberation entailed. Perhaps none of them relished the slaughter that might follow, but the great masters had made their choice. The final offer of surrender was delivered at mid-morning. The messenger returned, trembling, with word that the Meereenese laughed and threatened to feed him to the fighting pits. Daenerys' jaw tightened. Enough! She mounted her mare and rode to the front lines, accompanied by the Unsullied and a host of freedmen. Thousands looked to her, chanting Misa or calling out blessings. She raised her hand for silence. "People of Meereen," she called, her voice magnified by the hush. "Hear me now. I have offered you freedom for all within your walls. I have given you every chance for peace, to end the cruelty of slavery and live without fear. Your masters have refused. They defy my right to claim these lands for those they oppress. They answer mercy with barbarism. No more." Her words carried across the field, ringing off the walls. From the ramparts, the Meereenese soldiers jeered. Daenerys closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. Then she opened them, lifting a gauntlet hand toward the sky. Drogon's roar tore through the air, a clarion call of war. He dived from a height unimaginable, black wings folded to his sides, plummeting toward the city's outer walls. Arrows shot up in vain. Scorpions fired heavy bolts. One bolt struck Drogon's flank but did not pierce his scales, glancing off with a screech of metal. Daenerys heard the onlookers gasp. Then came the moment that would live in infamy. Drogon unleashed a torrent of dragonfire so intense that the stone of the outer wall glowed red, then collapsed into molten ruin. Great cracks spiderwebbed through the ramparts, and entire parapets crumbled. Soldiers on the wall died instantly, their screams lost in the roar of flame. In the span of heartbeats, an entire section of the fabled walls of Meereen was reduced to slag. Rhaegal and Viserion followed suit, their combined flames punching holes in the city's defenses that had stood for centuries. Daenerys spurred her mare forward, leading the Unsullied through the shattered breach. A wave of dust and heat washed over them, but they pressed on, disciplined and lethal. The freedmen poured in behind them, some brandishing spears or knives, others simply raising their fists in rebellion against their former masters. Battle raged in the streets. The Meereenese who resisted were cut down swiftly by the Unsullied, whose training and discipline far outmatched the city guard. Sellswords hired by the great masters found themselves outnumbered and demoralized in the face of monstrous dragons that soared overhead. Flames licked at the rooftops of the outer districts, and columns of smoke rose toward the scorching sun. Amid the chaos, Daenerys led from the front, flanked by Yora and Barristan. Grey Worm directed his soldiers with precision. Citizens fled in terror, but Daenerys ordered her forces to spare all who did not bear arms. Slaves rushed to throw off their shackles, some turning on their masters in a frenzy of pent-up rage. The city's fighting pits erupted with rebellion from within, as chained fighters banded together to seize control, choking the great master's capacity to deploy reinforcements. It was not a bloodless conquest, for many died. Yet it became clear that Meereen's defenders stood no chance against the unstoppable might of Daenerys's host. A turning point came when Drogon perched upon the Great Pyramid, his roar echoing through every street. The symbol was unmistakable. Meereen had fallen. By dusk, the city surrendered. Daenerys strode through the Great Pyramid, eyes blazing with determination. She demanded an immediate end to the fighting and commanded that all slaves be released. The great masters who still lived, those who had not died in the assault, were brought before her. Many trembled, expecting execution. She gazed down at them, recalling the torment they had inflicted upon thousands of innocents, the atrocities pinned upon the city gates, the mockery of her demands for mercy. "You saw what my dragons can do," she said in a voice as cold as Valyrian steel. "You brought this upon yourselves, yet I spare your lives. For now, you will answer to a new order, an order where no man, woman, or child lives in chains." With those words, she sealed the fate of Slavers Bay. Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, all were under her dominion, their slaves freed, their masters humbled. She established councils, appointed governors, and tried to restore a sense of peace. But her mind could not rest. She had accomplished so much in so short a time, at a cost of war and bloodshed, yes, but also with the gift of liberation for countless souls. Yet there were nights when she gazed upon her dragons, especially Drogon, and wondered if she had unleashed something that even she could not contain. He towered over the Great Pyramid, perched on its apex, his wings folded like thunderclouds. Regal and Viserion prowled the city's outskirts, each a colossal force in its own right. News of these three unstoppable beasts spread in all directions. Merchant caravans carried tales of the Mother of Dragons with them, fueling rumors of an unstoppable conqueror who might one day cross the sea. In the quiet hours, Daenerys would wander the halls of the pyramid alone. She would pass frescoes depicting the city's triumphs, the battles won by slave soldiers. Now, those halls echoed with a different kind of hush. The hush of a people unsure whether to exult in their new freedom or tremble at the presence of living gods overhead. It was on one such night, when the moons shone over Slavers Bay, that Daenerys found herself back on the terrace, the same vantage from which countless great masters once looked down on slaves in the streets below. She glanced down at the city that had been conquered in the name of freedom. Torches dotted the winding roads, and the flicker of lamplight made it appear as if Meereen itself still burned. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and a curious tang that brought to mind raw magic. When she turned, she saw a lone figure leaning against a pillar, the same red-robed priestess who had once appeared in Astapor. A swirl of robes parted the shadows, revealing the lines of her face, the glint in her eyes. "You?" Daenerys said softly, no real surprise in her voice. "I have done what was necessary. I have freed Slavers Bay. My dragons have become greater than any who walked this earth since the days of old Valyria. Tell me, is this what your Lawler wanted? Was this the destiny you spoke of?" The priestess inclined her head, a wisp of red hair catching the moonlight. "You have brought fire and freedom to these lands. The shadows recoil from your children. Yes, this is part of the vision. But it is not the end." Daenerys Stormborn. Not the end, Daenerys echoed, glancing toward Drogon, who roosts on the apex of the pyramid. He grows still. All of them do. How can I control them if they surpass every limit known to man? The priestess stepped forward, her voice solemn. They are not meant to be controlled, not in the way men have tried in the past. They are bound to you by blood and flame, by the power of your birthright. But they are also living embodiments of the Lord of Light's will. When darkness gathers, they shall be the beacon that burns it away. Daenerys frowned. What darkness? The White Walkers of the far north, the armies that march in Westeros, the wars of men? I have heard rumors, but little more. I have looked into the fires, the priestess said, her tone distant. War is coming from beyond the narrow sea. War such as the world has not witnessed in countless generations. And yes, from the frozen north, an ancient evil stirs. Dragons of ice, some call them. Others speak of the long night. You must be ready. Daenerys's pulse quickened. I must cross the sea then. The Iron Throne is mine by right, but my father's sins still stain my name. Will they welcome me? The priestess's eyes gleamed. You are Azor Ahai reborn, or so the flames whisper. The people may fear dragons, but they will rally around a savior who can drive back the darkness. Go to Westeros. Fulfill your destiny. A swirl of conflicting emotions flooded Daenerys. I cannot simply abandon the people here, she said. I promised them freedom. I must see that promise fulfilled, that they do not fall back into chains when I leave. In time, you shall find those who will rule wisely in your stead. The priestess assured her. There is still more for you to do here before you sail. But know this. When the hour is darkest, your dragons will be the flames of life that scorch the darkness from the world. That is R'hlloreth's gift to you. Daenerys's gaze wandered toward Drogon again, her thoughts swirling. The beast shifted, his black wings silhouetted against the twin moons. Even at rest, he radiated an energy so potent it made the air ripple around him. What would he be in another year? Another month? The pace of his growth was unnerving, as if every day soared beyond the realm of possibility. She thought of the old Targaryen kings, of Aegon the Conqueror upon Balerion. This overshadowed even that. She remembered the tales. Balerion's fire burned Harrenhal to the ground, melted towers, turned the stone to scorched ruin. Drogon, with time, might lay waste to entire kingdoms if his fury were unleashed. Could she harness that fury to save the world from the nightmares that lurked beyond her current horizon? The priestess touched Daenerys's arm lightly, an odd gesture of comfort. You fear what you must become, she said gently. But the greatest fires are kindled from the smallest spark. You have already set the world aflame. Now you must decide whether you will burn it to ashes or give it new light. Daenerys closed her eyes, the weight of that choice settling on her shoulders. She recalled the moment she hatched the eggs, the searing heat, the birthing of dragons long thought extinct. She remembered the screams of the slavers, the relief of the freedmen, the hush as Drogon scorched Yunkai's walls to rubble. She could almost feel the life force of the dragons pulsing through her veins, as if her bond with them was not just that of a mother to her children, but something older, more elemental. When she opened her eyes, the priestess was gone, vanished like an apparition. Daenerys stood alone on the terrace, the city of Meereen sprawling below, her armies resting in the streets. She listened to the stirring of her dragons, felt the embers of destiny crackle through her mind. No one else could face what she must face. The Targaryen line had been born of fire and madness, forging a legacy of conquest that had once united the Seven Kingdoms. If her dragons were truly destined to become greater than Balerion, if she was to harness that unstoppable might, she must walk a perilous path, one that demanded wisdom, compassion, and unyielding strength in equal measure. The days that followed were consumed by the task of stabilizing Meereen. She opened the fighting pits, but only to free those forced to fight. She insisted that if men wished to fight voluntarily, they might do so under rules that preserved dignity and safety. Some revolted at this notion, for the cruelty of blood sports was deeply ingrained in Meereenese culture. Yet Daenerys held firm. She had learned harsh lessons about compromise, but she refused to compromise on the core of her beliefs. No man or woman should be forced to bleed for another's entertainment. Her dragons roamed the skies, overshadowing the city. Each morning, Daenerys awoke to the thunder of Drogon's wings as he set off to hunt across the desert. Sometimes he flew east, sometimes west, always returning with kills large enough to feed an army. The carcasses left behind were sometimes charred, sometimes barely recognizable. Rhaegal and Viserion followed in his wake, devouring the remnants. The Freedmen Council in Meereen praised her name, but the whispers of fear persisted. People called Drogon the Winged Storm, the Scourge of the Sands, the Living Flame. They called her dragons the Second Doom of Valyria, prophesied to shape the fate of the known world. Occasionally, rebellion flared. There were murders in the night, the sons of the Harpy creeping forth to strike at those loyal to Daenerys. She punished them swiftly, employing the Unsullied to root them out. At times, she allowed the mere sight of Drogon flying overhead to quell the conspirators. The threat of unstoppable draconic wrath was enough to keep most silent. But Daenerys knew fear alone was not a foundation for peace. She worked tirelessly to set up a fair system of governance, to incorporate freedmen into the city's functioning, to rewrite laws that had once enabled the sale of flesh and blood. Months passed in this manner. Each day, Daenerys kept watch on her children's growth. The changes were less shocking than before, but still significant. Drogon was now a gargantuan presence, larger than any living creature known to exist. His head alone was bigger than a warhorse. The flap of his wings churned up dust storms that lashed the city's outskirts. Rhaegal and Viserion trailed behind in size, but they, too, were well on their way to surpassing the fabled drakes of Valyria's prime. Scattered arrivals reached Meereen from distant lands, Bravos, Volantis, even Westeros. Merchants, mercenaries, envoys, and curious wanderers. They brought stories of the changed world. The War of the Five Kings in Westeros still smoldered, though it had quieted in some corners. Rumors of unnatural cold in the far north. Talks of the Iron Throne in disarray. And always, they spoke of Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, whose monstrous children were said to loom larger every day. She listened to these tales with a calm facade, though inside she felt the pull of home. Westeros, the Iron Throne she had been taught was hers by birth. The impetus to sail and claim it grew stronger with each rumor of the crown's weakening hold. Yet Slaver's Bay was not wholly stable. She feared that if she abandoned it too soon, the freedmen might slip back under the yoke of cruelty. She struggled with the demands of statecraft, trying to ensure that the freedom she'd brought was not a temporary gift. Still, the day came when she knew she must prepare for the crossing. The nightmares of unending darkness in her dreams persisted, and sometimes she saw shapes of ice swirling amidst the flames. She recalled the Red Priestess's warning, "Darkness gathers." She had tried to be the queen these people needed, but a greater threat loomed beyond the sea. Her place was in Westeros. She felt it in her bones. She issued orders to begin building ships or purchasing them from merchant fleets. She had wealth enough now, gleaned from the treasuries of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. She began training her freedman army alongside the Unsullied, forging them into a force that could protect the Bay even in her absence. And, in a decision that weighed heavily on her heart, she prepared the city for the possibility that she might take the dragons with her. Near the end of her stay in Meereen, she witnessed a sight that stole her breath. Drogon soared above the city at dusk, wings coloring the sky a deep crimson. The sun's dying rays struck his scales, making him glow like living coal. The horizon stretched wide, and for a moment, Daenerys imagined the entire world under those wings. He roared, the sound reverberating through the clouds, and she thought, if Balerion could see this, he would bow. In that instant, she understood that if the rumors of the White Walkers were true, if an endless night threatened to sweep over the lands, then perhaps this unstoppable fire might be the only force to halt it. She had read old scrolls in the Meereenese libraries, gleaning scraps of knowledge that mentioned the long night and the hero who rose to banish it. Azor Ahai had forged a sword of flame, Lightbringer. But here, Daenerys had 3 living blades of unstoppable heat. If the darkness came, she would meet it with dragonfire. That night, she walked among the towers of the Great Pyramid, the warm breeze tugging at her robes. She found the highest balcony, the one that overlooked the entire city and the harbor beyond. The sky was strewn with stars, and below, Meereen flickered with torchlight. There, in the hush of the night, Drogon glided down to land behind her, shaking the stones with his colossal weight. He sniffed the air, his breath hissing past teeth as long as swords. Slowly, Daenerys turned to face him. He was enormous, his obsidian scales shimmering in the moonlight. She stepped forward, one hand trembling, the other reaching out. Drogon lowered his massive head, letting her place her palm against his brow. The heat rolled off him in tangible waves, but she did not shrink back. She felt his mind reaching for hers in that intangible bond they shared. "You are the greatest that ever lived," she whispered, scarcely believing her own words. "Greater than Balerion, greater than any dream of Valyria." He rumbled low, a sound that could have been agreement or simply the deep breath of a primordial beast. She recalled the countless hardships she had endured since the day she was sold to Khal Drogo, the illusions she overcame in Karth, the raw terror she had felt in the House of the Undying, and the moment of transcendence in the funeral pyre when she had birthed him. Everything had led to this. She pressed her forehead to his scaled snout, feeling the pulse of living flame beneath the surface. "If the Lord of Light has truly chosen us, then let us be his harbinger. But if this is my own destiny to shape, then let it be shaped by my hand." Somewhere in the darkness, Regal roared, a distant echo across the city. Viserions' cry followed. They were calling to each other, calling to her. She closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her, letting the heat remind her she was alive, that her heart still beat in her chest. She was Daenerys Stormborn, the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons. With each city she freed, her name grew. With each day, her dragons grew. And soon they would cross the sea to reclaim the throne stolen from her bloodline. Yet more than that, they would be the shield against an ancient darkness. If the Red Priest spoke truly, she made a silent vow. She would be the queen that her father never was. She would temper her dragon's fury with mercy, her ambition with justice. But she would not hesitate to unleash their wrath if the world required it to survive. The power of old Valyria was reborn in her children, magnified by whatever cosmic fire Lawler had kindled within their hearts. When at last she opened her eyes, Drogon withdrew, stretching his wings wide. With a single bound, he launched himself off the pyramid's edge, soaring into the star-flecked sky. She watched him ascend until he was no more than a vast silhouette against the moon. Then, with a final cry, he vanished into the night, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Tomorrow, she would continue her preparations to depart Meereen. The time of crossing drew near, the time of war yet again, but also a time of prophecy. The Iron Throne waited, but so did the gathering shadows from the far north. Whatever came, she would face it with dragons mightier than the world had ever known. For they were born of her flesh and magic, tempered by the trials of this hard land, and fueled by the blazing force of an ancient god's design, or so the Red Priests claimed. She looked out once more over Meereen, remembering its screams of battle and the cheers of liberated slaves. She thought of Astapor, of Yunkai, of every step that had led her here. She felt in her heart that the darkest battles were yet to come. But she was not afraid. Let them come, she thought. Let the White Walkers rise. Let the false kings muster their armies. Let the rest of the world doubt or tremble. She had faith in her dragons. And she had faith in herself, the unburnt queen shaped by the flames. In the end, she knew there would be fire. It would rage through the lands, forging a new age from the ashes of the old. Her dragons would continue to grow, no longer bound by the limitations that once held them back, an echo of the old Valyrian sorceries that had birthed their breed. By the power of the Lord of Light, or by her own unstoppable will, they would become the greatest creatures to grace the skies of this world, flames incarnate, ready to devour the night and bring dawn in their wake. and Daenerys Targaryen would guide them. She would see her children grow until their wings covered continents and their roars shook the pillars of heaven. She would lead them to Westeros, to claim the throne or burn away the shadows that threatened to engulf it. In that final hour, she would stand at the apex of history, a Targaryen queen with dragons far mightier than even Balerion the Black Dread. For this was her song, the song of fire that began the day she walked into Drogo's funeral pyre and emerged unscathed, cradling 3 newborn hatchlings. Now they were no longer hatchlings, nor mere beasts. They were living cataclysms, forging a legend that stretched beyond mortal comprehension. Let the world tremble. Let the very stars take note. Daenerys Stormborn would meet the coming darkness with a conflagration that none could withstand, and in that fire, a new dawn would be born. Daenerys Targaryen stood atop the Great Pyramid of Meereen as dusk spilled a wash of crimson over the city below. The desert wind tugged at her silver-white hair, carrying the sense of spice, sweat, and the faint tang of smoke that still lingered from the recent battle. Slavers' Bay had been liberated. Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen all bowed to her banner, and yet she did not feel the relief of a final victory. Each city bore its scars. Rubble-strewn streets, half-burnt walls, uneasy alliances forged in the blood of former masters. Although she had imagined sailing west to reclaim the Iron Throne, something tethered her to the east. A pull of destiny, or so the Red Priests muttered, kept her here. Below, the Freedmen Council struggled to keep order in newly born democracies. Thousands of men, women, and children once chained had to learn the meaning of liberty, a lesson as fraught with terror as with joy. With each passing day, Daenerys realized just how delicate freedom could be. Conquest might be swift, but forging a just peace required years of labor and a steadiness she feared might slip through her fingers like desert sand. Her dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, were never far from her thoughts. Each time she gazed upon them, their growth startled her anew. Drogon especially loomed larger with every moon's turn, eclipsing the very memory of Balerion the Black Dread. The black-scaled dragon's wings made the air tremble as he flew, while the streets below erupted in a hush that mingled awe and dread. Rhaegal and Viserion, shining green bronze and white gold, soared alongside their brother, each formidable in its own right. Where once they had fit upon her shoulder, now they dwarfed warhorses, mammoths. Indeed, many said they could one day eclipse entire mountains. Yet she still sensed their bond, an unbreakable thread forged by blood and fire. She had planned to cross the sea. Missandei, loyal as ever, had assembled envoys to treat with passing merchant fleets in the hopes of hiring a great flotilla. Ser Jorah Mormont had ridden forth to gather intelligence on potential allies in the Free Cities. The Unsullied, led by Grey Worm, drilled daily on the outskirts of Meereen, forging a disciplined host that could one day challenge any Westerosi army. And yet, each time she prepared to make the crossing, the East tugged her back. It came in rumor or omen. Turmoil in the Red Lands beyond Lhazareen, war brewing among the Dothraki hordes, unrest in Volantis where new revolts against slavery were stirring like embers in a hearth. And always, the Red Priests whispered of a destiny not yet fulfilled. She felt it in her bones. Her crusade to break chains was not done. The burden of a queen weighed upon her. The knowledge that Slavers' Bay might collapse back into tyranny without her presence kept her restless at night. Some nights, she dreamt of building not just 3 free cities but an entire free continent, a bulwark against the old ways of whips and human chattel. And she dreamt of her dragons roaring across distant skies, turning deserts to glass, seas to steam, forging alliances with peoples she had never yet encountered. It was after one such dream, feverish and vivid, that Daenerys awoke and summoned her council at dawn. The pyramid's highest audience chamber still showed the marks of conflict. Scorched pillars, cracked mosaics that once lauded the great masters. Her throne was a simple structure of carved wood reinforced with brass. She had refused to sit on anything that resembled the opulence of the old slavers. Around her stood Missandei, Ser Barristan Selmy, Ser Jorah Mormont, Grey Worm, and a smattering of newer advisors. Freedmen who had proven themselves in governance, scribes who knew the ways of eastern trade routes, even a couple of priests of R'hllor who lingered at the edges like silent specters. "I have had word," Daenerys began, her voice resonant in the hush, "from the caravans that arrive from the south. They speak of Lhazareen in chaos. Raiders, bandits, many of them Dothraki, have ravaged the region, enslaving or slaughtering the lamb men. My freedman council in Yunkai warns me that some of these new slavers have begun smuggling captives into the city's outskirts, hoping to circumvent my ban." Missandei's brow creased. "We have tried to intercept such smugglers, Your Grace, but the territory is vast. They travel by night, use hidden roads. Even the Unsullied cannot be everywhere." Daenerys looked to Grey Worm, who stood at attention, calm as ever. "How many do we have to spare?" 2,000 Unsullied can be dispatched," he replied, "but that may weaken Meereen's defenses. The sons of the Harpy still lurk in the shadows, and Yunkai requires patrols to maintain order." Ser Barristan stroked his white beard. "Your Grace, a bold strike might be necessary to discourage these raiders. If they are indeed Dothraki, they will fear your dragons. A show of force, or an alliance with the Lamb Men, might dissuade further attacks." Ser Jorah inclined his head in agreement. "The Lhazareen remember how you once spared them. If you ride to their defense, you will strengthen their loyalty. Though caution is wise. The Dothraki seas are endless, and the Khalasars are numerous. Confronting them might provoke open war." Daenerys swept her gaze across the room. "War might come regardless if slavers are emboldened. My vow was to end slavery throughout these lands. I will not allow any new chains. Not in Lhazar, not in Yunkai, not anywhere." The Red Priests, robed in tattered crimson, listened with rapt attention. One of them dared step forward, a woman with eyes like smoldering coals. "Azor Ahai must bring the dawn," she intoned softly. "Where darkness encroaches, the flame must answer. This is the will of R'hllor." Daenerys fought the urge to roll her eyes. She had grown weary of cryptic pronouncements. Still, she could not deny that the Red Priests, at times, provided useful intelligence through their networks of believers. "Then let the flame answer," she said in a measured tone. "We will muster a host and march for Lhazar to break these raiders. Grey Worm, select 1,000 of your best. Ser Barristan, you and Ser Jorah will ride with me. I'll leave the freedmen councils to manage the city. They have shown they can govern in my absence." So it was decided. Within days, the Great Pyramid's courtyards bustled with preparations. Supplies were loaded onto wagons. The Unsullied polished their spears. Freedmen volunteers joined the column, and Daenerys arranged for a rotating guard to watch over Meereen. She would not be gone forever, but she could not simply ignore the plight of those outside her city walls. If she intended to rule Slaver's Bay, or the entire East, she must prove her protection extended beyond the city gates. Her dragons sensed the stirring of adventure. Drogon soared overhead daily, prowling the skies as if eager for new hunts. Rhaegal and Viserion circled the outskirts, their roars echoing across sun-baked farmland. Some inhabitants quailed at the mere sight. Others cheered, for they believed the presence of dragons guaranteed their safety from any threat. Each dawn, Daenerys would stand on the walls of Meereen, gazing eastward, wondering what trials awaited her in the Red Lands and beyond. On the morning they departed, the sky was brushed with pale gold, and a warm wind swept in from the bay. Daenerys rode at the head of the column, astride a silver mare, her hair bound in braids that recalled her time among the Dothraki. Grey Worm marched beside her, the Unsullied's armor gleaming in orderly rows. Missandei rode in a small carriage further back, overseeing the scribes and supply wagons. Ser Barristan, mounted on a sturdy courser, was to Daenerys's left, wearing a simple white cloak over his steel. Ser Jorah rode on her right, vigilant as ever. They wound through the city's grand gates, enormous portals that still bore scorch marks from Drogon's assault, and ventured into the open plains. Freedmen flocked to see them off, many offering baskets of dates and figs, or jugs of water, chanting "Mysa, Mysa," in voices that soared with hope. Daenerys waved, her heart lifted by their gratitude. yet weighted by the knowledge that she carried their future with her. The journey southward stretched across arid plains and rocky hills. The sun scorched relentlessly, shimmering in waves on the horizon. At night, they camped in the open, ringed by unsullied sentries. Daenerys would slip from her tent to stand under a sky thick with stars. Sometimes she spied one of her dragons in the distance, a dark shape perched upon a crag or circling in the moonlight. She found comfort in their presence, even as her mind spun with the responsibilities that awaited her. After a week, they reached the outskirts of Lhazareen. A dusty valley spread before them, dotted with sun-baked fields and slender rivers that shimmered like quicksilver. The Lamb Men, as the Lhazareen were known, had always been a peaceful people, more inclined to prayer and farming than warfare. The devastation they had suffered under Khal Drogo's Khalasar, years past, remained a raw memory for Daenerys. She recalled the horrors inflicted upon them, the cruelty she had witnessed, and her desperate choice to spare the women. Now, she prayed she could atone further by safeguarding this land from new ravagers. A trio of Lhazareen scouts approached cautiously, bearing news of raids deeper in the valley. Daenerys greeted them with respect, offering water and the assurance of protection. Their leader, a wizened elder named Zadok, struggled to contain his tears as he recounted how the raiders swept in at dusk, torching crops, taking captives for the flesh trade. Each time, they vanished into the craggy foothills as swiftly as they came. Ser Jorah studied a crude map scratched into the dirt. "We should set a trap," he suggested. "Place a false caravan, lure these raiders into the open. Then your dragons can strike." Daenerys' face tightened. "I won't risk innocent lives as bait." Barristan offered a gentler approach. "Perhaps we can position the Unsullied in hidden formations while a decoy force draws the raiders out. No actual innocents, just soldiers disguised as farmers." Grey Worm inclined his head. "The Unsullied will do as you command. We can disguise ourselves if needed." The plan, once formed, hinged on the hope that the raiders would attack again. In truth, Daenerys suspected they would, for such men rarely stopped unless met with overwhelming force. She ordered the Unsullied to prepare an ambush in a wide, shallow valley dotted with the remnants of scorched farmsteads. Her dragons would remain hidden at first, roosting behind the hills. If the raiders were truly Dothraki, they would not be easily frightened by the sight of a small caravan. But dragons might still break their courage. At sunset the next day, with the sky dyed a bruised purple, the trap was laid. Daenerys watched from a ridge, flanked by Barristan and Jorah. Below, a small band of Unsullied disguised in simple robes led a string of pack mules loaded with sacks. The rest of the Unsullied were concealed amid rocky outcroppings. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the sigh of the wind through dry grass. Darkness deepened, the stars glimmering faintly overhead. Then came the thunder of hooves. Daenerys stiffened, peering into the gloom. Shapes materialized on the far side of the valley, dozens at first, then scores, riders with rocks glinting in the moonlight. A ragged banner fluttered among them, though she couldn't make out its design. They split into two wings, circling wide to surround the unsuspecting farmers. When they drew within bowshot, Ser Barristan gave the signal. The disguised Unsullied dropped their sacks and threw off robes, revealing polished spears. Trumpets rang out. An answering cry came from behind the hills. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion launched into the sky with roars that shattered the night's stillness. Fire lit the heavens as the dragons swept overhead, black silhouettes framed by scorching streams of flame. Panic seized the raiders. Some turned to flee, others reined up in confusion. In that crucial moment, the Unsullied rose from their cover and charged, spears at the ready. The skirmish was brief but brutal. Daenerys watched the arcs of steel glinting in the moonlight, the flicker of flames overhead. The air smelled of blood and burnt grass. She glimpsed men with shaved heads and braided tails typical of the Dothraki, though their braids were ragged and they wore scavenged armor, likely the remnants of smaller Khalasars that had broken apart. Drogon unleashed a blast of fire that swept across the rearmost riders, setting horses and men aflame. Screams tore the air. The rest scattered in terror. Grey Worm led a detachment in pursuit, cutting off their escape. Within moments, the raiders' leader, a scarred Dothraki with a close-cropped braid and a badly burned left arm, was dragged before Daenerys. He spat curses in a guttural mixture of Dothraki and common tongue, proclaiming that no Khaleesi would ever tame them. Daenerys stared him down. "Tame you? I have no interest in taming any man. But I will not tolerate slavers." Her words carried in the hush, and she saw the flicker of fear in his eyes at the mention of slavery. The Dothraki had always looked upon taking captives as spoils of war. "I give you a choice," she said, her voice resonating. "Renounce slavery. Swear to free every captive in your possession, or face dragonfire." The man sneered through clenched teeth. "We do not fear you, Stormborn. The Dothraki sea belongs to no queen." She inclined her head at Drogon, who perched behind her on a rocky ledge. A line of flame danced from the dragon's throat, illuminating the night. "Look again," she said softly. "You see the sky burn. Either you yield or face a fate far worse than you can imagine." The man broke under Drogon's glare, trembling. She gleaned from him that they were not a true Khalasar but a band of outcasts who preyed on weaker villages to survive. They sold captives to unscrupulous traders, some in Yunkai, others deeper east where smaller slave markets still thrived beyond Daenerys' immediate reach. Furious, she ordered the man bound. The surviving raiders were corralled under unsullied guard. Thus began a campaign that stretched across the Lhazareen borders. In the weeks that followed, Daenerys scoured the hills and ravines, breaking up slaver bands, liberating captured Lhazareen, and dealing harshly with those who persisted in the trade of flesh. Wherever rumors of raiders led her, she directed the unsullied to strike, sometimes accompanied by her dragons in a display of overwhelming might. Word spread swiftly. The mother of dragons would not tolerate any new form of enslavement in her domain. Some days, Daenerys herself led diplomatic missions into the heart of Lhazar's villages, bearing tokens of goodwill. The Lamb men, at first terrified, warmed to her presence when they recognized her from long-ago whispers, a queen who had once shown them mercy. Women draped garlands of flowers around her neck. Men bowed their heads in reverence. For all their peaceful nature, they feared the next wave of raiders if she left. Their eyes begged her to remain, to protect them. In the evenings, Daenerys grappled with the knowledge that she could not linger indefinitely. Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor were fragile, still teetering between freedom and relapse. The entire region seemed a tapestry of infinite threads, each one demanding her intervention. She found herself wishing she could be everywhere at once. She gathered reports of the east, beyond the Red Waste and along the Jade Sea, from travelers and merchants who drifted through Lhazar. They spoke of cities like New Ghis, Tolos, and Mantaries, places where the shadow of the Balerion freehold lingered, along with the old traditions of slavery. Some claimed monstrous beasts roamed the demon-haunted hills near the Valyrian peninsula. Others spoke of Sithorios to the far south, where jungle cities thrived on a trade of spices, ivory, and souls. Daenerys heard it all, uncertain whether to dismiss such tales as exaggeration. Yet a spark ignited within her. If slavery persisted in those lands, then her mission had not truly begun to blossom. Could she quell her compassion and simply leave the East to its own miseries when so many still languished in chains? Ser Jorah approached her one evening beneath the stark moonlight, finding her seated atop a small rise outside camp. Drogon's massive form lay curled at a distance, exhaling slow gouts of steam. The night was hushed, the sky spread with stars. "You look troubled, Khaleesi," Jorah murmured, using the old Dothraki term he had not spoken in some time. She glanced at him, her face framed by flickering torchlight. "I am troubled, Jorah. I feel as though I fight a many-headed beast. For every city I free, a dozen more remain in chains. For every slaver I punish, others take their place." She sighed, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I once thought all I needed were my dragons to bring justice. Now I see how vast the world is." He settled beside her, resting a hand on the hilt of his sword. You have already accomplished more than anyone thought possible. 3 slave cities freed. An army of Unsullied who follow you willingly. Your name spoken with awe across half the world. That is no small feat. But is it enough? She asked, her voice almost lost in the sigh of the wind. I came here to stop the raids on Lhazareen, and I have, for the moment, but there are lands far to the east where slavery thrives, unchallenged by anyone. If I leave, do I betray those people by turning my back on them? Or do I remain, risking everything I have built in Meereen? Yora regarded her quietly. And what of Westeros, the Iron Throne? She closed her eyes. Once, that throne had been her sole purpose, the dream that guided her through desert wastes and savage betrayals. But each step in Essos had entwined her fate with the people she liberated. I still yearn for the throne that was stolen from my family, she admitted. But if I sail now, I abandon countless souls. Cannot do that. Not while I have the power to end their suffering. He nodded, understanding. Then perhaps the solution is not to hurry west, but to push further east until you root out the worst of the slavers in these regions. Strengthen your hold, expand the freedmen councils, and create a lasting order that might stand whether you remain or not. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. You would follow me that far, into lands unknown? I followed you across the Dothraki Sea and the Red Waste, he said. And I will follow you still. In the days that followed, she tested the idea among her advisors. Ser Barristan seemed concerned about stretching their forces too thin, but he recognized her determination. Grey Worm spoke bluntly. The Unsullied would obey wherever she commanded. Missandei, her brow knit with worry, reminded her of the complexities in Meereen. Yet, in the end, they recognized that Daenerys Targaryen was not meant for half measures. If she declared war on slavery, she would not stop at the doorstep of Slaver's Bay. When at last Lhazareen was pacified, when the outlaws had been driven off or destroyed, the captive Lhazareen freed, and a handful of new watchers stationed to guard the region, Daenerys gave the order to march east. Not toward Karth or the Red Waste, but deeper south and southeast, following the caravans that led toward New Ghis, toward the old Ghis ruins. Rumors said these lands still clung fiercely to the slave trade, defying her edicts. She would see it ended. Her host swelled as they traveled. Freed Lhazareen followed behind, drawn by the promise of a queen who broke chains. Some asked to join her freedman army. Others simply traveled in her wake for protection, seeking new homes away from the ashes of raided farms. This slow-moving migration crossed sun-scorched terrain, passing canyons of red stone that glowed like coals at sunset. Days stretched into weeks, and the scorching heat tested even the Unsullied's endurance. Yet Daenerys pressed on, feeling the churn of destiny in her chest. At night, she would find her dragons circling overhead, sometimes perched upon towering rock formations. Drogon still led, an ebony storm cloud blotting out the moon whenever he passed. Rhaegal and Viserion followed, ever at his flank, their calls echoing in the darkness. They hunted wild horses and desert creatures, leaving scorched husks as evidence of their passing. Villagers in remote outposts fell to their knees at the sight of such monstrous power, hailing Daenerys as a goddess of deliverance or destruction, depending on their vantage. One evening, Daenerys found herself standing at a makeshift table in her tent, studying the roughly drawn maps her scouts had assembled. Ser Barristan pointed to a cluster of symbols scrawled along the coast of what was called the Gulf of Grief. Here lies New Ghis, once a colony of the old Ghis Empire. The people there hold tight to the ancient ways, including slavery. They've maintained trade with Yunkai and other slaver cities for centuries. If we hope to break the slave trade entirely, we must address them. Ser Yora nodded. New Ghis is an island city heavily fortified. You'll need a navy to lay siege or else the dragons. But word of your approach might force them to bolster their defenses. Daenerys gazed at the map, her mind churning. We have some ships in Meereen's harbor, but not enough to assault an island fortress. And building a proper fleet would take years. The dragons, though, she let the thought trail off. Grey Worm's voice was even unflinching. I have fought upon ships, your grace. It is difficult, but not impossible. The Unsullied can do it if you command. She stared at the map sketches of harbor defenses, chain booms, ballistae, tall towers. If I bring the dragons, they'll be met with scorpions and catapults. But Drogon's hide has turned aside worse. Regal and Viserion as well. If we can land a ground force while they're distracted by dragonfire, we might take the fortress. Barristan cleared his throat. A bold plan, your grace. One that might entail heavy losses. Her jaw set. I will not shrink from the challenge. To break the backbone of the Eastern slave trade, I must show them that no fortress is impregnable when a Targaryen queen and her dragons lay siege. They marched on, forging alliances where they could. Some remote villages offered supplies, won over by promises of protection from raiders. Others saw the dragons and needed no further persuasion. Yet Daenerys also encountered fear, for her reputation as a conqueror, some said a tyrant, spoke louder than her stated goals. More than once, her host came upon villages emptied of inhabitants who had fled rather than risk her wrath. As they neared the coast, the terrain shifted from rocky desert to salt flats and brackish marshes. The sun's glare off the water-soaked ground was blinding. Swarms of biting insects tormented them. Every night, Daenerys heard the restless murmur among her followers. How much further? When would they see the walls of New Ghis? Some wondered if they marched to certain doom. But she pressed forward, certain in her cause. Then, one sweltering afternoon, scouts returned with dire news. A host approached from the southeast, an army flying a banner of red harpy wings on a black field. It was said to be an alliance of Ghis nobles and scattered Sellsword companies, perhaps meant to intercept Daenerys before she reached their strongholds. She called her council at once, shading her eyes against the merciless sun. We must not allow them to outmaneuver us, she told Ser Barristan and Grey Worm. If they block our path to the coast, we'll be trapped between them and these salt flats. Barristan squinted at the horizon. Better to meet them on ground of our choosing. We can entrench near those rocky outcrops to the north, perhaps. Ser Jorah glanced at Daenerys. Or we use the dragons directly, break their host in one swift strike. Daenerys exhaled slowly. She had grown wary of unleashing dragonfire as a first measure, lest it lead to mass slaughter of conscripted fighters or civilians pressed into service. But these were slaver forces, intent on preserving their trade. Mercy for slavers might only strengthen them later. She balanced the logic carefully, recalling the horrors inflicted upon the innocents of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. Let them taste fire, she decided at last, though her voice held a note of regret. But we will offer surrender first. If their leaders refuse, Drogon's flames will speak. By dusk, her host occupied a crescent of high ground overlooking a broad, dusty plain. Torches ringed her camp. In the distance, she could see the glow of the opposing forces' fires, a distant line of flickering lights. The smell of tension filled the air. At dawn, Daenerys rode out with a small escort to parley, banners of truce raised high. Before her stretched a ragtag army of Ghis lords, mercenaries, and reformed slaver bands from Yunkai. Their leaders emerged. Gaudily dressed men with gilded helms, sneering Sellswords draped in furs from unknown lands. One man introduced himself as Shirako, a self-styled warlord of New Ghis. Shirako dismissed her with a curl of his lip. We know who you are, Daenerys Stormborn, the butcher of Astapor, the breaker of Yunkai's traditions. We will not let you spread your so-called freedom to the shores of Ghis. Daenerys took note of the slaves in chains behind him, used as porters and beasts of burden. Anger flickered like kindling in her chest. Then you refuse my terms? Yield, free your slaves, and no more blood will be spilled. His laughter was cruel. No man who bows to the harpy will ever yield to you. You are an upstart from across the sea, with a stolen army and beasts of flame. When we kill your dragons, we will parade their skulls through New Ghis to prove your weakness. She stared at him, her heart pounding. I have offered you peace. Remember that when the dawn rises on a field of ashes. With that, she turned her horse and rode back, refusing to entertain further insults. Ser Jorah trotted at her side, a grim satisfaction on his face. They sealed their own fate. Back in camp, Daenerys summoned Grey Worm and Barristan. Draw the lines for battle. The Unsullied will form the core. The freedmen levies can support the flanks. Drogon will strike first, with Rhaegal and Viserion following. Barristan bowed. At your command, your grace. Before the sun had cleared the horizon, the two armies stood arrayed across from each other. Dust swirled in the morning light, and a hush descended. Daenerys rode along the front of her host, her silver hair rippling in the breeze. She recalled the many battles she had fought and how each one had taken pieces from her soul. But this was what she had chosen. No one else could do what she must do. From the opposing line, horns sounded. Slaver cavalry moved to flank her. She signaled Grey Worm, who answered with a swift series of commands. The Unsullied pivoted, spears braced, forming a porcupine of steel. Archers moved into position, freedmen trembling but determined to follow their queen. In the distance, Daenerys spotted the banners of Shirako. He led a contingent of well-armed foot soldiers, their armor glinting like bronze serpents in the dawn. She glanced skyward. There, to the east, soared three shapes: Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion. She felt their presence as an extension of herself. With a silent prayer, she lifted her arm. The watchers in both armies saw the signal and the dragon's dove. Drogon's roar split the sky, a thunderclap of living fury. Flames erupted from his maw, sweeping across the front ranks of the slaver army. Bronze armor melted, flesh ignited, screams rent the air. Panic rippled outward. Some mercenaries attempted to launch bolts at the dragons, but most missed or glanced off the dragon's dense scales. Rhaegal and Viserion came behind, one belching green-tinged flame, the other a swirl of pale fire that roiled the dust into a blazing tempest. Under the cover of this fiery onslaught, the Unsullied charged. Their spears thrust in perfect unison, cutting down half-blind slaver troops stumbling from the flame. Freedmen archers loosed volley after volley, and the plain soon filled with the dead and dying. Smoke rose in black columns, stinging the eyes and throats of all who fought. Amid the chaos, Daenerys led a smaller cavalry contingent, flanking Shirako's command. The self-styled warlord struggled to rally his men. She saw him shouting frantically at his archers, urging them to target her specifically. A volley of arrows streaked her way, but Ser Jorah and Barristan shielded her. Grey Worm's ranks quickly intercepted, and the few arrows that came close bounced off the Unsullied's locked shields. Shirako, in a last desperate move, charged at Daenerys with a handful of mounted retainers. She reined her mare aside, letting her men meet the blow. Spears skewered horses and riders alike. Barristan faced Shirako blade to blade. Though old, the Kingsguard knight moved with lethal grace, slashing the warlord's reins, unhorsing him. Shirako tumbled to the ground, and an Unsullied spear pinned him there. By noon, the battlefield belonged to Daenerys. Smoke and dust obscured the carnage, and the reek of burnt flesh choked the air. Survivors among the slaver army, those who did not flee, fell to their knees throwing down weapons. Daenerys accepted their surrender but made it clear: any who had trafficked in slaves would be punished. The freed conscripts were given mercy and offered a chance to join her host or return home unshackled. At the center of the field, Drogon descended, scattering ash and debris with each mighty wing beat. Rhaegal and Viserion landed nearby. Daenerys walked among them, her heart weary. This was victory, but she took no joy in the slaughter. She saw men and women weeping, some screaming for lost companions. She recognized the thousandfold horrors that war unleashed. Yet she told herself that these were slavers, abusers, those who sought to keep entire peoples in chains forever. If her dragons were instruments of terror, at least they tore at the roots of injustice. That evening, she established a rudimentary camp. The wounded were tended to, the dead buried or burned. She insisted on meeting with the freed conscripts, hearing their stories. Many were poor folk pressed into service, forced to fight for their Ghis lords. Some had families in far-off villages. Daenerys provided them with meager rations, an escort away from the battlefield if they wished. A handful, those who still reeled at the sight of her dragons, chose to join her cause, swearing that no slaver would ever control them again. Shirako, near death, lay on a pallet in a makeshift cell. His flesh was scorched where dragonfire had brushed him, and a spear wound festered in his side. Daenerys visited him once. He coughed blood, glared at her with hate-filled eyes. "You think you are righteous," he rasped, "but you are just another tyrant who burns cities." She studied him. "Cities of slavers, yes. I gave you a chance to yield, and you spat on it. You have reaped your own fate." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a hacking, painful wheeze. "Kill me then, Dragon Queen. I will not kneel." With a mixture of pity and resolve, Daenerys turned away. "I have no interest in prolonging your suffering. Find your peace in the next life if there is one." She nodded to the unsullied guard, who swiftly ended Shirako's life with a single thrust. No rousing triumph, no parade, just the flicker of a dying man's breath carried away on the wind. Word of this victory spread quickly, carried by stray survivors and caravans that skirted the battlefield. Before Daenerys' host had marched a day beyond the site, they encountered messengers from New Ghis, nervous, wide-eyed men who knelt in the dust before her. They pleaded for negotiations, claiming to represent certain factions within the city that wished to avoid the fate of Shirako's army. Daenerys listened, her posture regal but unyielding. If New Ghis would surrender its slaves, dismantle its trade markets, and open its gates to her freedmen councils, then no dragonfire would scorch their walls. If they refused, she would unleash a siege that the city would never forget. The negotiations dragged on through nights of tense discussion. Daenerys discovered the city was divided. Younger nobles who feared the unstoppable might of dragons argued for surrender, while older, staunch loyalists insisted on fighting to the death. She pressed her demand: unconditional emancipation for all slaves in New Ghis, oversight by a freedmen council, and a pledge to end any participation in slave raids or markets. The messengers paled at her terms, but what choice did they have? The dragons soared overhead each dawn, an unmistakable reminder. Eventually, word came that the gates would open to her. Daenerys, accompanied by her unsullied and a handful of advisors, approached the city walls at daybreak. New Ghis was an island fortress connected to the mainland by a causeway, flanked by rocky shoals. Great towers rose from the outer ramparts, painted in the dull reds and blacks of the old Ghis tradition. She remembered that the Ghis Empire had once challenged Valyria 5 times, only to fall. Now a Targaryen queen had come, echoing those ancient wars in reverse. As the gates swung open, Daenerys felt the eyes of thousands upon her. Men in proud, if battered, uniforms stood aside, their spears lowered in submission. Beyond them stretched a city of winding streets, multi-tiered towers, and an architectural style reminiscent of old Ghis. She rode in calmly, her banners fluttering, the unsullied in perfect formation. The freedmen in her train gazed about, seeing a place that had never before bowed to any conqueror from across the sea. Representatives of the city's ruling families, decked in jewels and layers of thick, stiff robes, waited in a grand plaza just inside the gates. They bowed low as Daenerys dismounted. She felt their resentment simmering beneath forced politeness. "Welcome to New Ghis, Your Grace," said a man named Harmac, who appeared to speak for them. We hope to reach an amicable agreement." Daenerys studied his face. "Amicable, yes, provided you free every slave in this city." She scanned the plaza, noting the hush that fell. "Have you done so already?" She sensed hesitation, but Harmac bowed again. "We have begun the process," he said. "The city is large and many households must be convinced. We assure you it is our wish to avoid bloodshed." Her tone sharpened. "I have heard such promises before. Know this, my Unsullied will search every corner of this city for those still in chains. If we find any sign of slavery continuing in secret, the penalty will be swift and terrible. Do you understand?" Harmac's face blanched. "I do, Your Grace. We will cooperate fully." Over the next days, Daenerys enforced a systematic search, dividing the city into districts. Freedmen scouts accompanied the Unsullied, knocking on doors, inspecting warehouses, rooting out hidden cells. While many slaves were indeed set free openly, some masters tried to hide their property, believing a bribe or a locked basement might escape the conqueror's notice. Daenerys handled each violation with unwavering resolve. The freed slaves joined her cause, and the offending masters were stripped of wealth, sometimes imprisoned or executed if they resisted violently. No small number of newly freed men and women surged into the streets, chanting Daenerys' name and hailing her as a savior. Others, especially in more remote quarters, gazed upon her with apprehension, uncertain whether a foreign queen's victory truly meant a better life. Daenerys met with local leaders who professed loyalty to her freedmen council. She impressed upon them the necessity of forging a new order, one that would survive without her constant presence. A new council was formed, mixing local Ghiscari who swore to renounce slavery and newly freed citizens. She recognized that trust would not grow overnight, but the seeds were planted. During this period, Drogon, Regal, and Viserion roost atop the city's highest towers, overshadowing the skyline. Their presence cowed any thought of rebellion. Yet Daenerys could sense the growing tension in the air. The city's old guard chafed under humiliations inflicted by these outsiders. She worried that as soon as her back was turned, they might attempt to restore their power. But she could not remain in every city she conquered. Instead, she installed a garrison of Unsullied and a freedman militia, volunteers from among the local freed slaves, tasked with keeping the peace. Weeks passed, and word of Daenerys' triumph in Yunkai spread. Merchants from across the Jade Sea arrived to behold the city newly opened under Targaryen rule. Some carried news of other bastions of the slave trade, Tolos, Mantaries, and further east still, rumors of smaller city-states that clung to the old ways. Tempted as she was to push onward, Daenerys paused to consider her next step. She recalled the lesson of Meereen: conquest could be undone without stability. She asked Missandei one morning, as they walked along the city's harbor wharves, "If I keep pressing forward, how can I be sure these cities won't slide back into cruelty the moment I march away?" Missandei, wearing a simple linen dress in the moist sea air, answered thoughtfully, "By building strong ties of commerce, my queen. If these cities profit more from freedom than from bondage, they will have less reason to revert. But such change requires time." Daenerys gazed at the anchored ships, some bearing foreign flags she did not recognize. "Time. I have spent so much of it here already, while Westeros remains in chaos. Yet if I leave, I betray everything I stand for." As she wrestled with this, new challenges arose within Yunkai itself. Freedmen reported acts of sabotage, poisoned wells, warehouse fires, even kidnappings. An underground faction of slaver sympathizers, calling themselves the Taloned Hand, operated in secret. The Freedmen Council pleaded for Daenerys' help in rooting them out. Frustration warred with duty in her heart. So once more, she turned from the thought of sailing west and focused on the struggle at hand. She dispatched Grey Worm and the Unsullied to conduct nighttime raids on suspected hideouts. She gave local freedmen the authority to form watch patrols. She had Barristan coordinate with the scribes to carefully track the city's grain supplies, suspecting the saboteurs aimed to starve the new order into submission. The tension reached a boiling point when, late one evening, a group of masked men attempted to assassinate Daenerys in her temporary quarters, a renovated estate overlooking the harbor. Ser Barristan foiled the attack, slaying 2 of them, while a third managed to escape. The incident left Daenerys shaking with fury. She summoned Harmac and other local nobles, demanding they aid in eradicating the Taloned Hand or face immediate punishment. Harmac, sweating profusely, protested his innocence. "These fanatics act without our knowledge. We have no love for them. Please, Your Grace, show mercy. We will redouble our efforts to uproot them." Daenerys' patience had frayed. "Prove it," she said. "Bring me their leaders or their heads, and demonstrate that you care more for this city's future than its past." Under intensified pressure, the conspirators grew desperate. A A spate of arson attacks terrorized the nights, with hooded figures slipping from alley to alley. More freedmen watchmen were killed. Daenerys, heartsick at yet another city sliding toward chaos, turned to the only tools that never failed to command fear: the dragons. Night after night, Rhaegal and Viserion soared low over the rooftops, watchful, while Drogon perched high above the harbor, a living sentinel of flame. The conspirators' movements became more frantic, for they knew each flick of scale could bring fire down upon them. Inevitably, they were discovered in a cellar beneath an abandoned temple. Grey worms unsullied stormed the hideout. A brief but savage skirmish ensued. By dawn, the leaders of the Taloned Hand were dragged before Daenerys, battered and bloodied. She recognized among them 2 minor nobles who had once bowed to her, promising to uphold her edicts. Betrayal weighed on her like a millstone. She thought of how she had tried to rule Meereen with mercy, only to face repeated treacheries. "There will be no mercy for you," she said to the kneeling conspirators in the plaza. The Freedmen Council watched, silent. "You have shed innocent blood to preserve a legacy of chains, and so you have chosen your fate." She gave them to the flames, not by the hand of her swordsman, but by Drogon himself, who bellowed as Daenerys spoke the dreaded word, "Dracarys." In a single breath of fire, the conspirators' screams ended. The crowd recoiled in horror, yet a grim satisfaction rippled among the freed people. Justice, perhaps, but a justice painted in fire and death. In the aftermath, the city grew quiet with dread. Daenerys made it clear that any further plotting against her Freedmen Council would be met with the same. "I did not come here to slaughter you," she announced, her voice carrying through the plaza. "But if you force me, I will not hesitate. Slavery ends here, in new guise, and across all the lands I hold." Slowly, stability returned. The Freedmen Council gained confidence, enacting policies that tied the city's prosperity to trade rather than the sale of flesh. Scribes and merchants began to accept that a new era had arrived. One enforced by dragons, yes, but promising wealth if they adapted. Daenerys left a garrison of Unsullied in the city to safeguard the Freedmen Council. Then, finally, she prepared to continue her mission. Her next destination lay further east. Tolos, a city rumored to still conduct hidden slave markets. She did not intend to conquer every city in the known world, only to ensure that the root of slavery was severed beyond easy regrowth. Perhaps if Tolos fell, other enclaves would submit without bloodshed. Then maybe she could look west again to the 7 kingdoms. She only hoped that her dream of the Iron Throne had not withered in her prolonged absence. Their march away from New Guise was accompanied by a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Daenerys felt as though she carried the burden of 1,000 souls behind her. The freedmen who followed her cause grew in number, a roving community that believed in her vision of liberation. Others parted ways, content to remain in New Guise under its new regime, hoping for peaceful days ahead. Drogon soared overhead, his gargantuan wings stirring gusts that rattled the newly unfurled banners of House Targaryen. Beside him, Rhaegal and Viserion let loose shrill cries, as if heralding the next chapter of Daenerys' campaign. She wondered if one day the world would speak of her as they once spoke of Valyria, an unstoppable power that swept across continents. Would they call her a conqueror or a liberator? Or both? As the days melted into weeks, she led her people through rugged coastal paths, crossing shallow inlets and stony beaches where the Jade Sea lapped with emerald foam. The climate grew humid at times, hinting at jungles further south. Occasionally, strange beasts were spotted in the distance, long-necked creatures or scaled monstrosities that prowled the edges of the known world. Daenerys found herself marveling at how much of Essos remained beyond her knowledge. The West had always been her dream, but the East was an uncharted tapestry of wonders and horrors. At night, she pored over the intelligence brought by her scouts. Tolos, perched on a high plateau near a bend of the Jade Sea, boasted thick walls and a powerful naval presence. Its wealth derived not only from slaves but from exotic goods, spices, gems, and dyes that found markets as far as Karth and Westeros. If Tolos fell in line with her anti-slavery edict, It would send a shockwave through the region's trade networks. But Tolos was not the only name on her lips. Mantares, an ancient city, rumored to be a place of dark sorcery and twisted creatures lurking in the gloom. Merchants who had passed near Mantares spoke of mutations, abominations rumored to roam the surrounding lands. Daenerys knew that if she truly meant to end the slave trade, she could not ignore Mantares, for it lay on a major route to the ruins of old Valyria and beyond. Stories even suggested the Red Temple had little foothold there, overshadowed by darker powers. Some nights, she dreamt of shadows with wings far greater than her dragons, illusions of the old empire that once reigned supreme. She would wake in a sweat, hearing the echo of that same whisper grow, a voice that could have been Lhazareen or something else. She did not know if it urged her dragons to become unstoppable or if it warned of an impending doom that only matched unstoppable might with unstoppable terror. One evening, a red priestess approached her camp, another wanderer in tattered crimson robes. She claimed to have traveled from Volantis, bearing tidings from the grand temple of R'hllor there. Her eyes gleamed with fanatic light as she hailed Daenerys as Azor Ahai reborn, the one destined to bring forth the new dawn. Daenerys listened politely, though with caution. The priestess spoke of a gathering darkness, a rumor that the long night might come again, and that only the fire of dragons could hold it at bay. Daenerys remained diplomatic. I do not deny the darkness beyond my sight, but my immediate concern is the living darkness of oppression here in Essos. Will your temple assist me in ending this? The priestess smiled, pressing a hand to her heart. R'hllor's flame reveals the path you tread is righteous. We shall assist in what ways we can, though not all the faithful share the same vision. Some cling to prophecies that swirl around other figures. But in Volantis, many fervent disciples speak your name. Daenerys recalled how the priests in other cities had praised her, how they claimed her dragons were the harbingers of the Lord of Light. Then let them speak it, she said. If they stand with me against slavery, I welcome their aid. If they seek only to use me for their own ends, they will find my flames burn as fiercely against false friends as against slavers. The priestess bowed, leaving after offering what cryptic insights she could. Daenerys filed it away with all the other swirling rumors. She would judge men and women by their deeds, not their prophecies. As the trek continued, she found herself forging new bonds with some of her freedmen. Among them was a young man named Hazrak, once a slave in Yunkai's fighting pits, who displayed a keen strategic mind and a natural leadership that endeared him to the freed volunteers. Daenerys tested his ability by placing him in command of scouting parties. He proved efficient, returning with detailed knowledge of Tolos's coastal defenses. Over time, she elevated him to a position of trust, drawing upon his counsel along with that of her older advisors. She also became closer to Missandei, who had evolved from translator to confidant and friend. Their private conversations often revolved around the complexity of rule. Missandei confessed she worried about the effect these endless wars had on Daenerys' spirit, that each city demanded a piece of her soul, leaving scars that might never heal. Daenerys thanked her for her concern but insisted she could not abandon the cause now. If anything, the suffering she witnessed fueled her resolve. Eventually, they stood upon a craggy overlook, gazing at Tolos in the distance. A walled settlement perched atop a plateau, ringed by thick ramparts that jutted like teeth. The Jade Sea shimmered beyond, dotted with ships, some merchant vessels, others likely war galleys. Smoke rose from the city's countless chimneys, giving the skyline a grimy haze. Daenerys felt her heart quicken. Here stood another test of her vow. She instructed Ser Barristan to lead a small envoy to the city's gates under a flag of peace, bearing a message of emancipation. The reception was frosty. Tolos's magistrates refused to meet with Barristan. They sent low-ranking guards to deliver a curt refusal. The gist was clear. Tolos did not fear the Dragon Queen. Let her come if she wished. Their walls were strong, their ships many, and their trade too valuable for a foreign warlord to disrupt. So be it. Daenerys laid plans for a siege, but Tolos was not easily cowed. Her host lacked a large navy, limiting her ability to blockade the city from the sea. Yet she had the dragons. Over several days, she probed the city's defenses, sending Regal and Viserion to threaten the ramparts, always out of easy range of scorpions and arrows. The defenders launched occasional bolts, but the dragons swerved gracefully, unleashing plumes of flame that scorched towers, scattering the watchmen. But Tolos did not fold. They believed perhaps that Daenerys might grow weary or that her dragons would falter under sustained siege. Daenerys knew she could not starve the city into submission in any short order. The Jade Sea provided Tolos with fresh supplies by ship. If she was to break them, she needed a decisive stroke, one that reminded them of the unstoppable might of dragons. At the same time, she wished to minimize the death of innocents. She remembered how, in Meereen, she had tried to spare the city an all-out inferno. Could she do the same here? She conferred with her advisors. Grey Worm proposed a night assault, using small boats to bring Unsullied close to the harbor walls while the dragons distracted the defenders. Ser Barristan worried about the hazard of crossing open water under enemy arrow fire. Hazrak suggested infiltrating the city with freedmen who might already dwell there in secret. Daenerys weighed each plan, searching for a path that favored minimal bloodshed yet guaranteed success. In the end, she decided to strike from multiple angles at once. At dusk, Drogon would lead a terrifying aerial assault on the city's main gates, drawing defenders to that quarter. Regal and Viserion would harry the harbor, scorching any ships that attempted to flee. Simultaneously, small boats loaded with Unsullied would slip past the city's outer watch, land along a quieter stretch of shore beneath the plateau, and scale hidden paths up the cliffside. If all went well, they would open a postern gate from within. Night fell, the moon swallowed by cloud. Daenerys stood near the rocky shoreline, the salt tang heavy in the humid air. She had parted ways with Drogon earlier, trusting him to circle wide and come at the city from the landward side. The hush of anticipation pressed upon her. Then she heard it, the roar of a dragon that made the mountains quake. Flames rose in the distance, painting the cliff faces in flickering orange. The assault had begun. She boarded a small galley with Grey Worm and a detachment of Unsullied. Oars dipped silently, carrying them toward the base of Tolos's looming plateau. The sound of alarm bells drifted across the water as watchmen on the ramparts spotted Drogon's assault. Arrow fire arced over the city walls, but none reached Daenerys's craft. She clutched the rail, heart pounding, praying that the distraction held long enough for them to land undetected. Overhead, Regal and Viserion arrived, screeching as they descended upon the harbor. Ships in port caught fire, masts crumbling under blasts of flame. Some archers on the quays loosed bolts, but in the confusion, many burned or fled. The city thundered with panic. By the time Daenerys's galley scraped against the rocky shore, no one stood guard to see them. The Unsullied jumped into waist-deep water, forging a path to a narrow trail that wound up the cliffside. Carrying ropes and grapnels, they ascended with silent efficiency. Daenerys followed, breath ragged, her boots slipping on wet stone. The air smelled of smoke. She peered upward, seeing glimpses of distant torchlight. Eventually, they reached a small plateau. Above them loomed a postern gate, a thick iron-bound door in the city's ring wall. A handful of Tolos guards stood watch, weapons in hand, scanning the darkness for threats. But they were not prepared for the disciplined fury of the Unsullied. Grey Worm and his men rushed forward, overwhelming the guards without giving them time to raise an alarm. One guard managed a strangled cry before a spear silenced him. Grey Worm and two others wrestled with the chains on the gate, raising it inch by inch until it yawned open. Daenerys led the way inside, stepping into a dark, winding passage that opened onto an inner courtyard. The city within was chaos incarnate. Flames danced on rooftops, horns blared, citizens ran panicked in the streets. Screams tore the night. She felt the old ache in her chest. Another city going up in smoke, despite her best efforts to minimize the carnage. The Unsullied spread out, methodically securing each intersection. Daenerys advanced toward the center of Tolos, a fortress-like structure rumored to be where the city's magistrates lived and stored records of slave transactions. If she could capture it swiftly, perhaps she could force a surrender. She passed through narrow alleys, stepping around piles of burning debris. Freed slaves emerged from hidden corners, some brandishing makeshift weapons. Wide-eyed with terror and hope, they saw her banners and pointed the way. At last, she stood before the fortress gates. They were barricaded from within. Arrows rained down from archers on the battlements, but the Unsullied's locked shields created a dome of steel. At Daenerys' order, a group of freedmen volunteers hurled pots of pitch at the gates, and Regal swooped low, unleashing a burst of greenish fire that turned the gates into a blazing pyre. The defenders broke, fleeing deeper into the fortress. Daenerys pressed on, leading her host through the smoke-choked courtyards. Shouts echoed in a dozen tongues. She encountered scattered resistance. Guards who fought desperately, men who wore the chain sigils of Tolos' slaver guild. They died as quickly as they were found. She gave them opportunities to surrender, but few took it. Her heart pounded with adrenaline and sorrow. This was war. Mercy was often lost in the roar of chaos. Finally, she emerged into the fortress's grand hall, a cavernous space with columns carved to resemble serpents coiled around kneeling figures. The center of the hall was lit by massive braziers, and in that flickering light, she beheld the magistrates of Tolos, huddled in a semicircle behind a row of mercenaries. Their faces were etched with terror. Overhead, the roof shook from the impact of distant dragonfire. Daenerys halted, the Unsullied forming a protective line beside her. She raised her voice above the din. "Magistrates of Tolos, I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. Lower your weapons. Surrender, and your lives will be spared." One of the mercenaries, a heavy-set man with a curved sword, snarled, "We'd rather die than yield to a foreign queen." She nodded grimly. "Die, then." She gestured, and Grey Worm's men advanced. A brief but vicious clash ensued, spear points darting, swords ringing. A few mercenaries dropped their blades, but most fought to the end, cut down in a flurry of steel. When the last sword clattered to the floor, the magistrates sank to their knees, hands raised in surrender. Smoke from the burning gates wafted into the hall, and the glare of flames wreathed Daenerys in a hellish glow. She stepped forward, her voice resonant with authority. "I claim this city in the name of freedom. Any who resist me will perish. Those who lay down arms and renounce slavery shall live." The lead magistrate, trembling, spoke haltingly. "We yield. Tolos yields. We will free the slaves. Just spare us." She studied them. Once again, she felt the weight of being judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. "Swear it before these witnesses," she said, pointing to the battered freedmen who had entered behind her. "Swear that Tolos shall never again traffic in flesh, and you may keep your lives." They stammered out oaths, each word dripping with desperation. Daenerys motioned the Unsullied to secure the prisoners, then strode deeper into the hall. She gazed upon the carved serpents, the bound forms that symbolized the city's old power. Another monument to cruelty, another fortress that fell to the unstoppable might of dragons. For a moment, she closed her eyes, recalling her dream of forging a new world in fire and blood. How many more times must she burn cities to break the chains of the innocent? Still, the night was not done. She ordered the city properly secured, the watchfires lit, and the Freedmen Council erected under her oversight. Tolos was not as large as Meereen, but it boasted enough trade lines that her victory would send ripples across the region. She installed Hazrak to help with the city's transition. Freed slaves flooded the streets, many in tears, hugging each other, chanting Daenerys' name. Others stood in shell-shocked silence, uncertain if this liberation would last or if it was merely a new tyranny in different clothes. At dawn, Daenerys walked along the fortress ramparts, surveying the smoldering ruins of the harbor below. The remains of Tolos' war galleys listed in the water, scorched by dragonfire. Regal perched on a half-collapsed watchtower, nibbling at the charred wreckage of a ship's mast. Viserion circled above, scanning for any sign of renewed resistance. Drogon was nowhere in sight. She suspected he had landed outside the city, perhaps to feast on the carcasses of fallen mounts. Her hair hung loose, frazzled by the night's exertion. She tasted ash on her lips. Beneath her, the city was eerily quiet, punctuated by distant sobs and moans. The price of conquest. She felt Ser Jorah's presence before he spoke. He approached carefully, mindful of the soot and debris. "We've done it," he said softly. "Tolos is yours." She managed a weary nod. "For now." His eyes flicked to her. "You doubt it can hold?" "I doubt everything," she admitted. "I doubt the magistrate's sincerity, the freedman's acceptance of new rule, the capability of my garrisons to keep order. But I had no choice, Jorah. If I turn my back on these slavers, they will regroup and enslave new victims. How can I be the breaker of chains if I stop halfway?" He laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No one questions your resolve, Khaleesi. Your war on slavery is reshaping the East. The name Daenerys Stormborn will echo in every port, every caravan route, every temple. You are forging a legacy." She gazed at the rising sun, her heart heavy. A legacy soaked in blood and ashes. So many cities burned, so many lives ended. "I pray the world we build will be worth the cost." He said nothing, for there were no easy assurances. Instead, they stood in silence, side by side, as dawn spread its light over Tolos's ravaged skyline. In the days that followed, Daenerys repeated the routine she knew so well, establishing a freedman council, overseeing the liberation of slaves from hidden corners, punishing those who defied her orders. She strove to keep the dragons under control, mindful that their ferocity, while useful in war, could sow unnecessary terror if left unchecked. She had Grey Worm's men systematically dismantle the old slaver infrastructure. She found storerooms stacked with manacles, ledgers detailing slave shipments, and once again she felt that familiar anger coil in her chest. Yet she found flickers of hope. Freed children who ran to her with tear-streaked faces, calling her Mysa. Men who had spent years in chains now dancing in the wreckage of their masters' halls, newly free. For them, she reminded herself this was necessary. Her dragons might be weapons of mass destruction, but they had become the guardians of a new dawn. A full moon later, the city had stabilized enough for her to contemplate the next move. Her scouts reported that Mantaries, to the north and west, remained shrouded in ominous rumors. Some slavers had fled there, hoping to hide behind the city's infamous walls and the fearsome legends of the surrounding lands. Daenerys felt a chill at the mention of Mantaries. Stories abounded of twisted monsters, cursed bloodlines, and warlocks who toyed with forbidden arts. But if slavers were there, then so must she go. As she prepared to leave Tolos in the hands of a freedman garrison, she received a visit from the Red Priestess who had once prophesied her great destiny in Meereen. Cloaked in the swirling gloom of Tolos's battered temple district, the priestess found Daenerys alone, walking among columns blackened by dragonfire. "I have seen visions," the priestess whispered, "shadows twisting upon shadows, an ancient darkness rising from the depths. Mantaries is a cursed place, my queen. The fires warn that if you go there, you will face illusions and terrors beyond mortal comprehension." Daenerys's pulse quickened. She recalled the House of the Undying, the strange visions that had nearly undone her. "I have faced illusions before. I emerged unburnt. But the illusions that lurk in Mantaries might not be so easily dispelled," the priestess intoned. "I fear for you, but also for the fate of your dragons. They are pure flame, and flame can be devoured by darkness if not carefully tended." Daenerys set her jaw. "I will not be turned aside by ghost stories. My cause does not yield to fear." The priestess bowed. "So be it, Azor Ahai Reborn. May the Lord of Light guide your flame." Then she departed, leaving Daenerys with a lingering sense of unease. That very night, Daenerys dreamt of Balerion the Black Dread looming over a shadowy city where the walls bled red, and serpentine creatures slithered through the streets. In the dream, Drogon emerged to challenge the ancient monster, and the two dragons clashed in a storm of fire, their roars cracking the earth. She woke, gasping, drenched in sweat. Missandei rushed in, concern etched on her face, but Daenerys only shook her head, unwilling to speak of the dream. Soon after, she mustered her host once more. The freedman army, now bolstered by recruits from Tolos who wished to fight for her, assembled behind banners that depicted a three-headed dragon breathing flame. Grey Worm drilled the Unsullied until they could march in lockstep across any terrain. Rhaegal and Viserion soared overhead, occasionally joined by Drogon when he deigned to linger near the column. The people of Tolos gathered at the gates to watch her depart, a mixture of relief and anxiety on their faces. She left behind a governance structure that mirrored Meereen's Freedman Council, hoping it would endure. The march to Mantaries led through broken hills, sulphurous vents, and patches of sickly vegetation. Every breath seemed tainted by rot. The further they went, the more the land felt wrong, as if warped by hidden forces. Scouts returned with stories of twisted animals, half-crazed hermits in the hills, and no shortage of ominous warnings from local folk who fled rather than approach Mantaries. Daenerys pressed on, though dread coiled in her belly. She recalled how Kartha's warlocks had tried to ensnare her illusions. She vowed she would not let her mind be toyed with again. As they neared the city's outskirts, the sky darkened with storm clouds that gathered in unnatural swirls. Thunder rumbled. Daenerys felt the dragonfire stir within her, as if answering the heavens' challenge. Drogon roared in the distance, echoing thunder with a defiant call. She was on the brink of another confrontation, this time not just with slavers, but perhaps with powers older and stranger than she had yet faced. Still, she did not falter. The realm of Essos was massive, riddled with secrets and horrors. Yet if Daenerys Targaryen was truly the mother of dragons, if she was the breaker of chains, the queen who refused to let the old evils of humanity persist unchallenged, then she would face even Mantaries. She would stand against nightmares if it meant freeing those enslaved in its grasp. So her army pressed forward, torches flickering against the gloom, unsullied spears gleaming dully in the half-light. The wind carried the stench of sulfur and a faint keening that might have been the wind or something else entirely. And Daenerys, astride her mare at the front of the column, lifted her gaze to see the silhouette of Drogon cutting across the sky like a living blade of darkness. She did not know what trials lay within Mantaries' twisted gates, but she knew one truth: she was not alone. She had her dragons, her Unsullied, her freedmen who believed in her cause. She had the legacy of her house, fire and blood, and a vow that no chain would remain unbroken in the lands she touched. If that meant walking into the jaws of a cursed city, so be it. She would do what she must, as she always had, forging a new path in a world hungry for change. And so Daenerys Targaryen continued her long sojourn in the East, growing her legend one freed city at a time, led by dragons larger than the world had ever known. Whether or not her name would one day echo across the narrow sea, whether Westeros would remember her as a liberator or a scourge, remained to be seen. For now, her destiny burned here, in the crucible of Essos, where the old ways of whips and chains met the unrelenting fury of dragonfire. And from that crucible, a new order would emerge, or the East itself would perish in the flames she unleashed. She prayed, in the darkest hours of night, that her flame would be a guiding light, not a spark that ignited an endless conflagration. But no matter what fate awaited her, Daenerys Stormborn pressed on, determined to break every chain she found, even if she had to shatter the very foundations of the world to do it.